Welcome, my friends. Tonight, you and I will descend into the shadows of history, into stories so dark, so twisted, that they almost seem too outrageous to be true. But truth, as we'll discover, can be far stranger and more disturbing than any fiction. Before we begin this journey into the corrupt hearts of those who claim to speak for God, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you settling in for the evening in New York? Is it the quiet hours of midnight in London? Perhaps you're starting your morning with coffee in Tokyo. I love knowing that we're all connected across time zones, united by our fascination with the darker chapters of human nature. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this journey is going to be unforgettable. Tonight's stories aren't just about corruption or scandal. They're about the terrifying reality that absolute power truly does corrupt absolutely, even when that power is wrapped in holy robes and blessed by sacred ceremonies. We're exploring the dark legacies of men who wore the papal crown not to guide souls, but to dominate, exploit, and deceive. From orgies held in the very halls of the Vatican to alliances with assassins and murderers, the worst popes in history remind us of a sobering truth. Not every man who sat on the throne of St. Peter was a saint. Some were tyrants, some were perverts, and some, God help us, were killers disguised in robes of white. These aren't pleasant stories, my friends. They're not the kind of tales you'll hear in Sunday sermons or find in children's books about religious history. But they're important because they reveal something fundamental about human nature. How even the most sacred institutions can be corrupted when flawed, ambitious, and sometimes evil men seize control of them. Tonight we'll meet popes who turned the Vatican into brothels, who sold the papacy itself for gold, who put corpses on trial, and who declared themselves gods on earth. We'll witness acts of cruelty so profound that they make medieval torture chambers seem merciful by comparison. And we'll discover that the phrase holy terror sometimes applies quite literally to those who claimed divine authority. But why does this matter now in our modern world? Because power hasn't changed. The temptations that corrupted these ancient pontiffs still exist today, perhaps in different forms, but with the same devastating potential. When we study these historical monsters wearing mitres, we learn to recognize the warning signs of corruption in our own time. These stories also remind us that institutions, no matter how revered, are only as good as the people who lead them. The Catholic Church has produced genuine saints, brilliant theologians, and compassionate leaders who dedicated their lives to serving others. But it has also elevated men whose souls were so dark that they turned the holiest office in Christendom into a throne of evil. So dim the lights, my friends. Turn on that fan for some white noise if you need it. Get comfortable, because we're going to spend the next few hours together exploring what happens when sacred power falls into the hands of the utterly profane. Sometimes our stories help you sleep. Tonight might not be one of those times. We begin in the 10th century, in an age when the papacy had become a prize to be won through violence, bribery, and political maneuvering. An era historians now call the pornocracy. Yes, that's a real historical term, when the highest office in Christianity was controlled by corruption, lust, and murder. Picture Rome in the year 955. It's a city where political alliances shift like shadows, where noble families wage bloody feuds in marble halls, and where the papacy itself has become nothing more than another piece on the chessboard of power. Into this world steps a teenager who would become one of the most scandalous figures in papal history. His name was Octavianus, but history knows him as Pope John XII. And from the moment he assumed the throne of St. Peter at just 18 years old, he didn't see the papacy as a divine calling. He treated it as his personal playground. What followed wasn't a legacy of sacred devotion, but a descent into scandal, violence, and unrestrained vice that would shock even the jaded nobles of medieval Rome. This is where our journey begins tonight, with a boy pope whose reign of terror would set the standard for papal corruption for centuries to come. Are you ready to meet the worst of the worst? He was just 18 when he became the most powerful religious figure in the Western world. Think about that for a moment. 18 years old, an age when most young people today are just starting college, figuring out their majors, maybe working part-time jobs. But in 955 AD, Octavianus found himself crowned Pope John XII, wielding spiritual authority over millions of souls across Europe. But this wasn't some divinely inspired calling or the result of deep theological study. No, John XII inherited the papacy the way other young men might inherit a family business, through raw political influence and dying wishes. His father, Alberic II of Spoleto, had essentially turned Rome into his personal kingdom, controlling the papacy like a puppet master, pulling strings from behind the scenes. On his deathbed, Alberic made the Roman nobles swear an oath that when the current pope died, they would elect his son Octavianus to the throne of St. Peter. It was nepotism on a scale that would make modern political dynasties blush. The Sacred College of Cardinals, meant to choose the wisest and holy man available, was instead forced to crown a teenager whose qualifications began and ended with having the right father. And what did this 18-year-old do with the awesome responsibility that had been thrust upon him? He treated it like the ultimate fraternity house, with himself as the permanent president of the most exclusive and depraved club in medieval Europe. Roman historians from the time, and remember, these were people accustomed to political corruption and moral flexibility, were absolutely scandalized by what they witnessed. They accused John XII of turning the Lateran Palace, the papal residence that should have been a beacon of holiness, into what they called a brothel. Prostitutes walked freely through halls that had once echoed with sacred hymns and theological debates. But it wasn't just about lust. John XII seemed to take perverse pleasure in defiling everything that was supposed to be holy. Sacred relics, objects that pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to venerate, were pawned off like common trinkets to fund his endless parade of parties and pleasures. Imagine the shock of faithful Christians who discovered that the bones of saints they revered had been sold to the highest bidder to pay for another papal orgy. Instead of preaching the Gospels, John XII was said to toast to pagan gods during drunken feasts, raising his goblet to Jupiter and Venus, while his bishops looked on in horror. He gambled with church funds, turning the sacred college into his personal casino. And these weren't small, private indiscretions. These were public spectacles that scandalized all of Rome. The psychological portrait of John XII that emerges from these accounts is deeply disturbing. Here was a young man who had been given ultimate authority with no preparation, no moral guidance, and apparently no conscience whatsoever. Power didn't corrupt him gradually. It seemed to unleash something that had always been there, waiting in the darkness of his soul. But John XII's reign wasn't just morally bankrupt, it was politically catastrophic as well. He managed to anger virtually every important ally the papacy had, most notably the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I. These two were supposed to work together, the spiritual and temporal powers of Europe united in common cause. Instead, John XII's behavior was so outrageous that he began secretly negotiating with Otto's enemies, playing a dangerous game of political chess while apparently too drunk or distracted to realize the consequences. Otto's response was swift and decisive. He marched on Rome with an army, forcing a synod to investigate the young pope's conduct. The accusations brought forward by bishops and cardinals read like a catalog of every sin imaginable: simony, murder, incest, and even invoking demons. These weren't whispered rumors or political smears. These were formal charges presented by the church's own hierarchy. The synod deposed John XII, but if they thought that would be the end of their problems, they were gravely mistaken. The teenager who had turned the Vatican into his personal playground wasn't going to give up power without a fight. He returned to Rome with a mob of supporters and immediately began taking bloody revenge on everyone who had dared oppose him. He mutilated his enemies with the casual cruelty of a psychopath. He executed bishops who had testified against him, turning the holy city into a charnel house. The boy who should have been Christ's representative on earth had become something far more sinister. A monster in papal robes, wielding divine authority like a weapon of personal vengeance. And then, as suddenly as his reign had begun, it ended in a way that was both mysterious and fitting for such a scandalous life.
The end came in 964 AD, and like everything else in John XII's short, dark life, his death was shrouded in scandal and whispered rumors that echoed through Rome's narrow streets for generations. One account, preserved by chroniclers who lived through these tumultuous times, claims that John XII died after being struck down by a jealous husband who caught the Pope in bed with his wife. Picture the scene: the most powerful religious figure in the Western world caught in the act of adultery, meeting his end at the hands of a cuckolded Roman citizen who cared more about his honor than papal authority. Another version of the story suggests he simply suffered a stroke while committing adultery. Divine judgment, some whispered, finally catching up with a man who had spent his entire reign spitting in the face of everything sacred. The medieval mind was always looking for signs of God's justice, and many Romans saw poetic retribution in a pope dying in the very act of sin that had defined his papacy. But regardless of which version of his death is true, the message was clear. Pope John XII had lived as he died, in complete defiance of everything the papacy was supposed to represent. He didn't pass away peacefully, surrounded by cardinals and bishops, receiving last rites and blessing the faithful. Instead, he died as he had lived, in scandal, in darkness, and the kind of circumstances that made even hardened medieval Romans shake their heads in disgust. The psychological implications of John XII's story go far beyond mere historical curiosity. Here we see what happens when absolute power is given to someone with no moral constraints, no sense of responsibility, and apparently no capacity for shame. It's a cautionary tale that resonates across centuries because the fundamental dynamics of power and corruption remain unchanged. Think about it. John XII didn't just fail to live up to the ideals of the papacy, he actively worked to destroy them, as if he found some perverse pleasure in taking everything that was supposed to be pure and holy and dragging it down into the mud. This wasn't simple weakness or human frailty. This was malicious, deliberate corruption of the highest order. His short life, he was probably only in his mid-20s when he died, was a masterclass in how power without accountability inevitably leads to moral catastrophe. He answered to no earthly authority, and he clearly didn't believe he would answer to any divine authority either. The result was a reign that didn't just stain the papacy, it defiled it in ways that took generations to cleanse. In the long shadow of church history, few names echo with as much disgrace as John XII. Medieval chroniclers, who were generally respectful of papal authority even when popes behaved badly, couldn't find words strong enough to condemn him. He became the standard by which other corrupt popes were measured, the ultimate example of what happened when sacred power fell into profane hands. But John XII's legacy extends beyond his individual crimes. His reign marked the beginning of one of the darkest periods in papal history, an era when the throne of St. Peter became little more than a prize to be fought over by competing noble families. His example showed ambitious men throughout Europe that the papacy could be seized and used for personal gain rather than spiritual leadership. The damage he inflicted on the Church's moral authority was incalculable. When people saw the Pope himself living like a pagan emperor, indulging in every vice while preaching virtue to others, it created a cynicism about religious authority that would echo through the centuries. Seeds of doubt were planted in the medieval mind that would eventually bloom into the Protestant Reformation. Yet perhaps there's a strange kind of value in studying figures like John XII. They remind us that institutions are only as good as the people who lead them, and that even the most sacred offices can be corrupted when they fall into the wrong hands. They serve as warning signs, showing us what to watch for when power begins to concentrate in individuals with lack of moral constraints. As we continue our journey through the dark corridors of papal history tonight, remember that John XII was just the beginning. His reign of terror established patterns of corruption that would be repeated, refined, and in some cases exceeded by the monsters who would follow him. Each story builds on the last, showing us how corruption, once established, tends to spread like a disease through the very heart of institutions meant to heal the world.
If John XII was the most depraved teenager to ever become pope, then Benedict IX was surely the most bizarre and arguably the most corrupt pontiff in the entire history of the Catholic Church. His story reads like something from a dark comedy, except the laughter dies in your throat when you realize that this actually happened, that this man actually existed and wielded ultimate spiritual authority over medieval Europe. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum, Benedict IX first took the papal throne in 1032, likely no older than 20. But age wasn't his only qualification for the highest office in Christendom. He came from one of the most powerful and aristocratic families in Rome, the kind of people who treated the papacy like a family business that could be passed down through generations. And what a family business it turned out to be. Chronicles from the period describe Benedict IX's first reign as nothing short of disgraceful. He was accused of rape, adultery, and even practicing black magic, accusations that, coming from medieval sources, weren't made lightly. These were people who believed in demons and devils, who saw spiritual warfare as a very real phenomenon, and when they accused someone of invoking dark powers, they meant it literally. Benedict was known to host wild orgies inside Vatican grounds, turning the holiest site in Western Christianity into what medieval chroniclers called a den of iniquity. The papal apartments, where previous pontiffs had spent long hours in prayer and contemplation, echoed instead with drunken laughter, the sounds of debauchery, and acts so shocking that even the famously corrupt Roman nobility demanded his removal. But here's where Benedict IX's story becomes truly unique in the annals of papal corruption. Most bad popes at least had the decency to cling to power until death or deposition. Benedict IX, however, discovered something that no pope, before or since, has ever attempted. He figured out how to turn the papacy into a commodity. His first papacy ended when he was driven out by a rebellion of disgusted Romans, but he returned shortly after, then left again, then returned again. The papacy had become a revolving door, with Benedict treating it like a seasonal residence he could occupy or abandon based on his mood or circumstances. Then, in a move that stunned even the most cynical observers of medieval politics, Benedict IX decided to do something that would forever stain the reputation of the Church. He put the papacy up for sale, not metaphorically, not through subtle political deals or arranged marriages, but literally. He approached his godfather, the archpriest John Gratian, and offered to sell him the papal seat for cold, hard gold. Think about the psychology behind such a decision. This wasn't a moment of desperate weakness or political necessity. This was a calculated business transaction, treating the throne of St. Peter like a piece of valuable real estate to be bought and sold at market prices. Benedict IX had reduced the spiritual leadership of Western Christianity to a simple commercial exchange with a handshake and an exchange of gold. But Benedict IX wasn't finished with his assault on papal dignity. After selling the title, he apparently experienced seller's remorse and decided he wanted it back. So he attempted to reclaim the papacy not once, but twice. Picture the chaos. The church now had 3 men simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pope, each with his own supporters, his own claims to authority, and his own version of how he had come to power. This wasn't just a political crisis, it was a spiritual catastrophe. How could Christians across Europe know which pope to obey? Which one had the authority to grant absolution, to consecrate priests, to make decisions binding on the faithful? The very foundations of papal authority were cracking under the weight of Benedict IX's greed and instability. The situation became so chaotic that Emperor Henry III had to step in militarily, calling a council to resolve what historians now call one of the greatest legitimacy crises in church history. The result was dramatic. All 3 competing popes were removed from office, and the church essentially had to start fresh with a completely clean slate. But the damage to papal authority was profound and lasting. Benedict IX had proven that the papacy could be bought and sold like any other commodity, that sacred power was just another form of merchandise in the corrupt marketplace of medieval politics. The aftermath of Benedict IX's papacy selling scandal reveals something deeply disturbing about how corruption can become institutionalized, how one man's greed can poison an entire system for generations. Benedict IX was excommunicated, not once, not twice, but multiple times over the years, depending on which faction held control of Rome at any given moment. Think about that for a second. The man who had once claimed to be Christ's representative on earth, who had worn the papal tiara and claimed divine authority, was repeatedly cast out of the very church he had once led. But even excommunication couldn't seem to stick to Benedict IX. Like a bad penny, he kept turning up, making new claims to papal authority, gathering new supporters, and attempting to reclaim what he had literally sold for profit. He treated excommunication the way most people treat a parking ticket, an annoyance to be ignored rather than a serious spiritual judgment. This pattern reveals something chilling about Benedict IX's psychology. Most people, even corrupt ones, maintain some vestige of shame or fear when it comes to divine judgment, but Benedict seemed to exist in a moral vacuum, completely detached from any sense of spiritual consequence. He had weaponized cynicism, turning it into a tool for personal advancement that made him essentially immune to the moral constraints that governed ordinary human behavior. The chaos he created had ripple effect that extended far beyond Rome. Across medieval Europe, bishops, priests, and ordinary Christians struggled with fundamental questions of authority and legitimacy. If the Pope could sell his office, what did that say about the sacraments he had administered? Were ordinations performed under his authority still valid? Could sins absolved by his priests actually be forgiven? These weren't academic theological debates. They were practical, urgent questions that affected the daily spiritual lives of millions of Christians. Benedict IX had managed to inject doubt and confusion into the very heart of Christian faith, making people question not just papal authority, but the entire structure of the church hierarchy. The psychological profile that emerges from Benedict IX's actions is fascinating in its complete absence of normal human constraints. Here was a man who seemed to have no concept of sacred and profane, no understanding that some things simply shouldn't be bought or sold. He had reduced the most sacred office in Christianity to a commodity, treating spiritual authority like livestock or grain, something to be valued, priced, and exchanged based purely on market forces. But perhaps most disturbing of all was his apparent belief that he could simply reclaim what he had sold whenever it suited him. This suggests a level of narcissism that borders on the delusional. The idea that his personal desires trumped contracts, agreements, and the entire institutional structure of the church. Benedict IX is remembered today not just as one of the worst popes in history, but as one of the most bizarre. His story reads like a medieval farce, except that the implications were deadly serious. He didn't just damage the papacy. He revealed how fragile the entire system of spiritual authority really was when placed in the hands of someone completely devoid of moral constraints. The man who treated the throne of St. Peter like a game of musical chairs had shown the world something that couldn't be unseen, that even the most sacred powers could be reduced to the most profane transactions. The papacy, which was supposed to be a divine appointment connecting heaven and earth, had been revealed as just another human institution subject to all the greed, ambition, and moral weakness that plagued every other form of earthly power. As we continue our journey through the dark corridors of papal corruption tonight, remember that Benedict IX's story isn't just about one man's greed. It's about what happens when entire systems lose their moral foundations. His shadow falls across everything that follows, a reminder that corruption, once established, tends to reproduce itself in ever more creative and destructive forms.
If there's one name that dominates every conversation about corruption in the Catholic Church, it's Borgia. The very sound of those syllables seems to carry the weight of centuries of whispered scandals, political intrigue, and moral decay. And at the dark heart of that infamous dynasty stood Rodrigo Borgia, who took the papal throne as Alexander VI in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for the New World, as if history was marking the beginning of a new age of both discovery and depravity. But Alexander VI didn't rise to the papacy through spiritual merit or theological brilliance. He bought his way into the highest office in Christendom through what historians now recognize as one of the most brazen examples of electoral corruption in papal history. The conclave that elected him was notorious for its backroom deals, lavish bribes, and promises of wealth and power that would make modern political corruption seem quaint by comparison. Think about the psychology of a man who would literally purchase the role of Christ's representative on earth. This wasn't someone who had experienced a spiritual calling or felt divinely inspired to lead the faithful. This was a businessman who saw an opportunity for the ultimate hostile takeover, and he was willing to pay any price to seize it. Once Alexander VI was enthroned, he wasted no time in revealing his true priorities. His papacy wasn't about shepherding souls or defending the faith. It was about expanding the Borgia dynasty by any means necessary. He openly acknowledged multiple children, including Caesar and Lucretia, figures whose own reputations would become soaked in legend, intrigue, and some of the darkest rumors in Renaissance history. Caesar Borgia, Alexander's son, was supposed to be a cardinal, a prince of the church dedicated to spiritual matters. Instead, he became a warrior politician who acted more like a mafia don than a church leader. He abandoned his cardinal's robes for armor, leading armies and conquering territories with a ruthlessness that would later inspire Machiavelli's famous treatise on political power. The man who should have been celebrating Mass was instead celebrating military victories built on violence, treachery, and strategic assassination. And then there was Lucretia Borgia, perhaps the most unfairly maligned figure of the Renaissance, but also the most symbolically important. Whether the dark rumors about her were true or simply the product of enemy propaganda, she represented something deeply unsettling about the Borgia papacy, the complete blurring of sacred and secular power, the transformation of the church into a family business run along dynastic lines. But Alexander VI's corruption went far beyond nepotism. He turned the Vatican itself into a stage for acts so scandalous that it shocked even the jaded nobility of Renaissance Italy. And remember, this was an era when political assassination was considered a valid career move, and poison was just another diplomatic tool. One of the most infamous events of his papacy was the so-called Banquet of Chestnuts, held in the papal apartments in 1501. According to contemporary accounts, Alexander VI invited 50 prostitutes to entertain his guests while he allegedly watched from his papal throne. The evening descended into an orgy of such spectacular debauchery that even hardened Renaissance courtiers were reportedly scandalized. Imagine the psychological state of a man who would literally stage such an event in the very heart of Christianity. This wasn't just personal indulgence, it was a deliberate desecration of everything the papacy was supposed to represent. Alexander VI seemed to take perverse pleasure in corrupting sacred spaces, in proving that his power was so absolute that he could transform the holiest places in Christendom into venues for the most profane entertainments. The dancers performed naked while coins were tossed to see who could catch them with any part of their anatomy except their hands. Meanwhile, the Pope, the supposed successor to St. Peter, the man who claimed divine authority over the souls of millions, watched it all unfold with apparent delight. It was as if he was conducting some kind of satanic mass, a ritual inversion of everything Christianity claimed to represent. But Alexander VI's corruption wasn't limited to personal indulgence. He had systematically transformed the church into a marketplace where everything had a price. Cardinalships were sold to the highest bidder regardless of merit, qualifications, or even basic competence. Sacred offices became commodities, and faith became just another currency to be manipulated for personal gain. The man had turned the administration of Christ's church into what was essentially a medieval crime family, with its own code of silence, its own system of rewards and punishments, and its own brutal methods for dealing with anyone who dared oppose the family's interests. Yet strangely enough, Alexander VI was also a skilled administrator who strengthened the papal states, reformed certain bureaucracies, and even commissioned some remarkable art. But none of these achievements could wash away the spiritual filth that surrounded his reign like a toxic cloud.
Alexander VI's death in 1503 came under circumstances so suspicious that they seemed almost scripted by the dark genius of Renaissance political intrigue. Some historians claim he was poisoned by mistake while plotting to kill a rival, a delicious irony that would have appealed to the Byzantine mind of a man who had spent his entire papacy weaving webs of deception and murder. Picture the scene. The Pope, who had poisoned his way to power, who had eliminated enemies through carefully orchestrated accidents and mysterious illnesses, finally falling victim to his own methods. Whether this account is historically accurate or simply the kind of poetic justice that people wanted to believe, it perfectly captured the moral universe that Alexander VI had created around himself. Even in death, the Borgia Pope managed to scandalize Rome one final time. His body reportedly became so bloated and grotesque during decomposition that it wouldn't fit into the coffin that had been prepared for him. Contemporary accounts describe a corpse so swollen and discolored that witnesses could barely recognize the man who had once commanded the spiritual allegiance of millions. There's something deeply symbolic about this final indignity. Alexander VI, who had spent his life inflating his power, his wealth, and his family's influence beyond all natural limits, ended up physically inflated beyond recognition. It was as if his body was providing a final grotesque metaphor for the spiritual corruption that had defined his reign. He was buried with little ceremony, rushed into the ground like a plague victim rather than honored like the supposed successor to St. Peter. No grand funeral processions, no weeping crowds of faithful Christians, no magnificent tomb befitting a papal legacy. Instead, there was embarrassment, haste, and a desperate desire on the part of church officials to move quickly past this particular chapter in papal history. The psychological implications of Alexander VI's story are staggering when you really think about them. Here was a man who had achieved the highest spiritual office in Western Christianity, a position that should have filled him with humility, reverence, and a sense of awesome responsibility. Instead, he used it as a platform for corruption so systematic and shameless that it defied comprehension. Alexander VI didn't just fail to live up to papal ideals, he actively worked to destroy them. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in proving that sacred authority could be weaponized for the most profane purposes. Every orgy in the Vatican, every murder disguised as accident, every cardinalship sold for gold was essentially an act of spiritual terrorism, an assault on the very concept of religious authority. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how effective he was at it. Despite all the scandals, despite the orgies and murders and blatant corruption, Alexander VI managed to strengthen the Borgia family's power and influence. His methods were morally bankrupt, but they worked. Evil, as it turned out, could be extraordinarily efficient when practiced by someone with sufficient intelligence and complete absence of conscience. To this day, Pope Alexander VI is remembered as arguably the most scandalous pope in the entire history of the Catholic Church. He didn't just defile the sanctity of the papacy, he weaponized it, turning the Church into an instrument of family ambition and personal gratification. Under his rule, the Vatican became something that resembled a throne room of ambition, lust, and whispered deaths more than the headquarters of a religious institution. The damage Alexander VI inflicted on the Church's moral authority was incalculable and long-lasting. When the Protestant Reformation erupted, just a few decades after his death, reformers like Martin Luther would point to the Borgia papacy as Exhibit A in their case against papal corruption. Alexander VI had provided them with ammunition that would fuel religious wars for centuries. But there's a strange lesson in studying someone like Alexander VI. His story reminds us that evil often comes wrapped in impressive packages, wielded by people who are intelligent, charismatic, and seemingly successful. He wasn't a cartoonish villain twirling his mustache. He was a sophisticated politician who understood exactly how to manipulate systems of power for personal advantage. His legacy serves as a permanent warning about what happens when sacred institutions fall into the hands of people who see them merely as tools for personal advancement. The Borgia name became synonymous with corruption not through accident or misunderstanding, but through the deliberate, systematic abuse of power by someone who had climbed to the very pinnacle of spiritual authority. As we continue our journey through papal darkness tonight, Alexander VI's shadow falls across everything that follows, a reminder that corruption, when practiced by truly gifted practitioners, can transform even the most sacred institutions into instruments of evil.
If Alexander VI represented corruption through calculated evil, Pope Stephen VI showed us something perhaps even more disturbing: corruption through complete psychological breakdown. His story takes us into territory so bizarre, so macabre, that it seems to belong more in a horror novel than in the annals of church history. Some papal scandals stained the church with greed, others with lust. But what Stephen VI did was so fundamentally unhinged that it bordered on the supernatural. It's remembered today as the Cadaver Synod, a trial unlike any other in human history, and hopefully unlike any that will ever be repeated. The year was 897, and Rome was in chaos, torn between rival political factions who treated the papacy like a football to be kicked back and forth between competing teams. Stephen VI had been placed in power by the powerful Spoleto family, who controlled much of central Italy
and saw the papal throne as just another piece of territory to be conquered and held. But Stephen VI wanted revenge on his predecessor, Pope Formosus. There was just one small problem with this desire for vengeance. Formosus was already dead. He had been buried months earlier, his body laid to rest in what should have been the dignity and peace that death traditionally provides. But death, as Stephen VI was about to prove, was no protection against the twisted logic of papal politics. So he ordered that the decomposing corpse of Pope Formosus be dug up from its tomb, dressed in full papal regalia, and dragged into the Lateran Basilica to stand trial for alleged crimes. Try to picture this scene, my friends. Imagine walking into one of Christianity's most sacred spaces and seeing a rotting corpse propped up on a throne, dressed in papal vestments, while a living pope screamed accusations at the decaying remains. It was theater of the absurd taken to its most grotesque extreme. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse, answering Stephen's shouted accusations while the audience, bishops, cardinals, and Roman nobles, looked on in horror and fascination. The charges were serious: perjury, violating canon law, and unlawfully ascending to the papacy. But the defendant was literally falling apart, pieces of decomposed flesh dropping onto the marble floor of the basilica. As the trial unfolded, the body slumped and swayed, held upright by attendants who must have wondered if they had stumbled into hell itself. The stench alone must have been overwhelming, but Stephen VI continued his prosecution with the fervor of a man completely divorced from reality. Eventually, in what might be the most surreal moment in papal history, Stephen VI declared the corpse guilty of all charges. The sentence was swift and brutal. The body was stripped of its papal vestments, the fingers used for blessing were severed, and what remained of Pope Formosus was thrown into the Tiber River like garbage. But this wasn't just madness, it was political madness with a purpose. By condemning Formosus posthumously, Stephen VI was invalidating all the bishops and clergy that his predecessor had ordained. This created a theological crisis that went to the very heart of church authority. If Formosus hadn't been a legitimate pope, then all his official acts were null and void, clearing the way for Stephen VI supporters to seize control of vacant positions throughout the church hierarchy. The psychology behind the Cadaver Synod reveals something deeply disturbing about how power can warp the human mind. Stephen VI wasn't just corrupt, he had apparently suffered some kind of complete psychological break that manifested in this grotesque theater of revenge. He had crossed a line that even the most hardened medieval politicians found shocking. The horror of what he had done didn't bring peace or political advantage, as Stephen VI might have calculated. Instead, it triggered riots across Rome. The Roman people, who were accustomed to political violence and papal corruption, were appalled by the desecration of death itself. There were some boundaries that even medieval cynicism couldn't cross, and Stephen VI had obliterated them. Months later, Stephen VI was imprisoned by his enemies, who had been energized by the public revulsion over the Cadaver Synod. They stormed his cell and strangled him to death, a fitting end, perhaps, for a man who had strangled the dignity of his office so completely. In the aftermath, the church tried desperately to bury the episode, both literally and figuratively. Pope Formosus's body was recovered from the Tiber and reburied with honor. Future popes nullified the Cadaver Synod's rulings and forbade such trials from ever happening again. But the damage was done. Stephen VI's legacy isn't one of theological achievement, political success, or even ordinary corruption. It's the image of a corpse on trial, a moment that turned the Vatican into a theater of the absurd, where death itself offered no protection from the madness of absolute power.
While many corrupt popes masked their sins with charm, indulgence, or at least a pretense of dignity, Pope Urban VI made no such effort. His reign, beginning in 1378, was marked not by quiet scandal or hidden vice, but by open hostility, paranoia, and terrifying violence that would make even modern dictators uncomfortable. Urban VI, born Bartolomeo Cugnano, was elected during a time of enormous tension in the church. The cardinals,
fearing the wrath of Roman mobs who demanded an Italian pope after decades of French domination during the Avignon papacy, chose him, hoping to calm the locals and restore stability to the church. But they had catastrophically misjudged their man. What they got instead was something that resembled a medieval Caligula more than a successor to St. Peter. Urban turned out to be volatile, suspicious, and possessed of a cruelty that seemed to have no limits. He didn't just rule with an iron fist, he ruled with clenched teeth, red face, and a rage that terrified everyone around him. From the very beginning of his papacy, Urban VI showed an almost pathological inability to work with others. He rejected advice from experienced cardinals, publicly berated his advisors for minor mistakes, and reportedly beat his staff for infractions that other leaders might have handled with a simple reprimand. The papal apartments, which should have been centers of spiritual reflection and wise governance, instead echoed with shouting, threats, and the sounds of physical violence. But Urban's paranoia grew rapidly, feeding on itself until it consumed whatever rationality he might once have possessed. He became convinced that his own cardinals were plotting against him, and instead of addressing their legitimate concerns about his increasingly erratic behavior, he responded with escalating brutality. When several cardinals did finally conspire to oppose him, or perhaps simply to escape his wrath, Urban's response revealed the true depths of his cruelty. He had them imprisoned in the papal dungeons, but imprisonment wasn't enough for his wounded pride and paranoid fears. He had them tortured with methods that would have been considered extreme even by the brutal standards of medieval justice. Contemporary reports described screams echoing through the Vatican walls as Urban VI's enemies were subjected to agonies designed to break both body and spirit. Some cardinals were brutally beaten until their bones broke. Others were slowly starved, watching their bodies waste away, while the Pope, who claimed to represent divine mercy, showed them none. 5 cardinals were executed without trial, their only crime being that they had dared to suggest that Urban VI might need to moderate his behavior. These weren't enemies of the Church or heretics challenging doctrine. These were fellow churchmen who had simply tried to counsel their pope toward a more measured approach to governance. The psychological portrait that emerges from these accounts is deeply disturbing. Urban VI seemed to interpret any disagreement as personal betrayal, any suggestion as rebellion that needed to be crushed with maximum force. He had transformed the papacy from a spiritual office to a dictatorship where absolute obedience was demanded and any hint of dissent was met with torture and death. But Urban VI's instability didn't just create personal tragedy. It precipitated one of the most damaging crises in church history. His violent paranoia led many cardinals to conclude that his election had been invalid, that someone so obviously unfit for papal authority couldn't possibly have been chosen by divine will. A group of cardinals fled Rome and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, based in Avignon. The result was what historians call the Western Schism, a catastrophic split that divided European Christianity for nearly 40 years. Different kingdoms backed different pontiffs, and beneath the surface of these political alliances, the unity of Western Christendom slowly fractured. Urban VI didn't try to heal these divisions or seek reconciliation with his critics. Instead, he excommunicated his rivals and ruled with increasing isolation, surrounding himself with sycophants and enforcers who were more like a medieval secret police than church officials. As his mental health deteriorated further, so did any pretense that his papacy served spiritual rather than personal ends. He died in 1389, alone, bitter,
and reviled by almost everyone who had known him. Even his own supporters seemed relieved when death finally ended his reign of terror. Urban VI had managed to alienate allies, destabilize Rome, fracture the church, and leave a legacy stained with the blood of fellow Christians. His story serves as a chilling reminder that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it can drive people completely insane. Urban VI wasn't just a bad pope. He was a tyrant whose paranoia and violence nearly destroyed the institution he claimed to lead. His shadow still lingers in church history as a warning about what happens when sacred authority falls into the hands of someone fundamentally unfit to wield it.
When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513, he wasn't stepping into a spiritual office so much as ascending to what he saw as the ultimate throne. Born into one of the richest and most powerful families in Florence, Leo had been groomed from childhood not for holiness, but for political power wrapped in religious authority. His famous words upon election reveal everything we need to know about his mindset. God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it. Not let us serve, not let us humble ourselves before this awesome responsibility, but let us enjoy it. In those 5 words, Leo X revealed that he saw the papacy not as a burden of service, but as the ultimate prize in a game he had been playing his entire life. And enjoy it he did, with an extravagance that would have made Roman emperors blush. Under Pope Leo X, the papal court ballooned into a theater of luxury that rivaled anything seen since the decadent days of the late Empire. Gold literally dripped from Vatican ceilings. Feasts stretched on for days, each one more elaborate than the last. The Pope surrounded himself with artists, poets, musicians, and performers, turning the Vatican into a Renaissance theme park with himself as the star attraction. Leo X was a genuine lover of beauty, culture, and intellectual pursuits. He commissioned works from masters like Raphael, filling the Vatican with artistic treasures that still dazzle visitors today. But beneath the surface of all this high culture lay financial ruin and a spiritual disaster that would ultimately tear Western Christianity apart. The problem was simple. Leo X's Renaissance fantasies cost far more than the church could afford. He drained papal coffers to fund his artistic ambitions, his elaborate court ceremonies, and his endless cycle of entertainment. When traditional church revenues couldn't keep pace with his spending, he began looking for new sources of income. And that's when Leo X hit upon an idea that seemed brilliant in its simplicity, but proved catastrophic in its consequences. He would literally sell salvation. He authorized and aggressively promoted the sale of indulgences, certificates that promised to reduce punishment for sins in exchange for monetary donations to the church. The marketing campaign was sophisticated and shameless. Priests across Europe stood in churchyards and public squares, proclaiming with theatrical flair, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." It was spiritual commerce reduced to its most basic level. Pay now, suffer later. And it worked, at least initially. Gold flowed into Rome from across Europe as Christians, desperate to secure their eternal fate, handed over their life savings for these papal promises. The poor sold their possessions, the middle classes emptied their savings, and the wealthy bought indulgences in bulk to cover entire families. But while Leo X was counting his profits and planning his next artistic commission, a storm was brewing in the northern reaches of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1517, a monk in the city of Wittenberg had finally had enough. His name was Martin Luther, and he was about to challenge not just Leo X's financial schemes, but the entire structure of papal authority. Luther's 95 theses nailed to the church door in Wittenberg were a direct protest against indulgences and the corruption they represented. But they were more than that. They were a fundamental challenge to the idea that salvation could be bought and sold, that the church could act as a middleman between God and individual conscience. How did Leo X respond to this theological earthquake? Not with humility, reflection, or any attempt at reform. He laughed it off, dismissing Luther as a drunken German who had changed his mind when he sobered up. When Luther didn't back down, Leo's response was swift and arrogant. He excommunicated the troublesome monk, apparently believing that papal authority alone would be enough to silence dissent. It was a fatal miscalculation that revealed just how completely out of touch Leo X had become. He had spent so much time in his Renaissance bubble of art and luxury that he couldn't recognize the genuine spiritual hunger that Luther was addressing. He thought he could solve a theological crisis the same way he solved budget problems, by throwing his weight around and expecting immediate compliance. The result was the Protestant Reformation, an explosion of religious revolution that shattered Western Christianity forever. Churches broke away from Rome, entire kingdoms declared independence from papal authority, and the religious unity that had defined Europe for over 1,000 years crumbled into competing factions. Leo X died in 1521, heavily in debt and apparently oblivious to the magnitude of the fire that he had helped ignite. His legacy is tragic in its irony. A patron of beauty who precipitated one of the ugliest religious wars in human history.
Long before the Borgia scandals or the Renaissance excesses that we've been exploring, there was a pope who set a precedent for corruption that would echo through centuries. His name was Sergius III, and his reign in the early 10th century marked the beginning of what historians now call the pornocracy. Literally, the rule of harlots. Yes, my friends, that's an actual historical term used by medieval chroniclers to describe a period when the papacy wasn't controlled by theological wisdom or spiritual calling, but by sexual politics, family dynasties, and the kind of corruption that would make a modern scandal sheet blush. Sergius III became pope in 904 after a bloody struggle that involved the assassination of his rivals, because apparently the medieval approach to papal elections sometimes resembled a gangster movie more than a religious ceremony. This was an era when the papacy wasn't a divine office so much as a prize in a brutal Roman power game, and Sergius was willing to kill for it. But what truly defined his papacy wasn't just the violence of his rise to power, it was his relationship with a noblewoman named Marozia, who belonged to the powerful Theophylacta family that essentially controlled Rome during this period. According to contemporary chroniclers, Sergius took Marozia as his mistress while she was still a teenager, beginning a relationship that would have consequences far beyond their personal lives. Think about the psychology of this arrangement. Here was a man who claimed to represent Christ on earth, who was supposed to embody celibacy and spiritual purity, openly conducting an affair with a young woman from one of Rome's most influential families. But this wasn't just personal indulgence, it was political strategy disguised as romance. Their affair produced a child who would later ascend the papal throne himself as Pope John XI. Yes, you heard that correctly. A pope fathered another pope. The throne of St. Peter had literally become a family business, passed down through bloodline rather than spiritual calling. The Roman clergy whispered about the relationship, and the public grumbled, but none dared challenge Sergius directly. He ruled with an iron hand, having already demonstrated his willingness to use violence to eliminate opposition. The message was clear: cross the Pope at your peril. But Sergius III's corruption went beyond his personal relationships. He presided over what was arguably the most morally bankrupt period in papal history, an era when the Vatican became a den of incestuous alliances and backdoor deals. The holiest office in Christendom had been reduced to a commodity controlled by one Roman family through seduction, manipulation, and hereditary succession.
Sergius also involved himself in one of the most bizarre episodes in papal history by restoring the memory of Pope Formosus, the same pope who had been subjected to the macabre cadaver synod we discussed earlier. But then, in a display of political expedience that would be impressive if it weren't so morally bankrupt, he had Formosus condemned again and reburied without honor. It was political vengeance disguised as papal authority, showing that even the dead weren't safe from the machinations of papal politics. He filled the Roman Curia with his supporters, creating a network of corruption that would outlast his individual reign. Church offices were sold to the highest bidder, sacred relics were treated like commodities, and the spiritual mission of the church was subordinated to the political and financial needs of the ruling family. Under Sergius III, the foundations of papal dignity didn't just crack, they crumbled completely. The Vatican, which should have been a beacon of spiritual leadership for medieval Europe, became something that more closely resembled a Renaissance court drama, complete with sexual intrigue, political assassination, and hereditary succession. Sergius died in 911, still in power, still feared, but never revered. His death marked the end of his individual reign, but not the end of the system he had helped create. The pornocracy he fathered would continue for nearly 60 years, during which the papacy was controlled by one Roman family through a combination of seduction, manipulation, and bloodline politics. The Theophylacta family, led by Marozia and later by her descendants, would install pope after pope, treating the sacred college like their personal appointments committee. Sacred authority became a hereditary privilege, passed down through generations like a family estate. Sergius III isn't as well known today as figures like Alexander VI or the other corrupt popes we've discussed, but in many ways, his legacy is more significant. He was the architect of a system that reduced the papacy to a family business, showing future generations that even the most sacred offices could be captured and controlled through a combination of violence, sexual politics, and dynastic planning. He was literally the father of the pornocracy, both through his child who became pope and through the system he had established. His reign proved that when sacred power falls into profane hands, the result isn't just individual corruption, but institutional decay that can last for generations.
When Pope Boniface VIII rose to power in 1294, he inherited a papacy already strained by political pressures and theological challenges. But instead of approaching these problems with humility or wisdom, Boniface chose a path that would lead to one of the most spectacular collapses of papal authority in history. He didn't just want to be pope, he wanted to be God on earth. Born Benedetto Caetani, Boniface VIII was the opposite of humble. His predecessor, Celestine V, had resigned from the papacy, an almost unheard-of act of humility that shocked medieval Europe. A simple monk who found himself overwhelmed by the responsibilities of papal office, Celestine had stepped down after just 5 months, claiming he was unfit for such sacred duties. Boniface, however, saw the papal throne not as a burden of service, but as the ultimate seat of earthly domination. From the moment he was elected, he made it clear that he had no intention of following Celestine's example of modest humility. Instead, he famously declared, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." These weren't just words spoken in private, they were public proclamations that revealed his megalomaniacal vision of papal power. But it was his papal bull Unum Sanctum, issued in 1302, that truly captured the staggering scale of Boniface's ego and ambition. In this document, he made claims about papal authority that went far beyond anything previous popes had dared assert. He declared that submission to the pope was absolutely necessary for salvation for every human being on earth. Not suggested, not recommended, absolutely necessary. Think about the psychology behind such a claim. Boniface was essentially declaring that he, personally, stood between every human soul and eternal salvation. He placed himself above kings, above emperors, above every earthly authority.
According to his twisted logic, political rulers derived their legitimacy not from God directly, but through him as God's sole representative on earth. He believed that not only did he rule the church, but that all of Christendom, indeed all of humanity, owed him absolute obedience. This wasn't just spiritual authority, it was a claim to universal temporal power that would have made Roman emperors blush. Boniface VIII had convinced himself that he was literally God's voice on earth, and that to oppose him was to oppose divine will itself. Naturally, this megalomaniacal vision brought him into direct conflict with the emerging nation-states of medieval Europe, particularly France. King Philip IV of France wasn't just any monarch. He was shrewd, ruthless, and deeply resentful of papal overreach. When Boniface issued edicts interfering with French taxation of clergy, essentially claiming that French priests answered to Rome rather than to French law, Philip responded with devastating effectiveness. Philip's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and brutality. Instead of engaging in theological debates about papal authority, he attacked Boniface personally, launching a campaign of character assassination that accused the Pope of heresy, immorality, simony, and even witchcraft. These weren't random accusations. They were carefully crafted charges designed to destroy Boniface's moral authority and justify resistance to his claims of universal power. What followed was unprecedented in the history of the papacy. In 1303, a group of armed men led by Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's agent, and Sciarra Colonna, Boniface's Italian enemy, stormed the papal residence at Anagni. They found the Pope sitting in his throne room, still defiant, still claiming divine authority even as armed enemies surrounded him. And then something happened that no Pope had ever experienced. They slapped him across the face. A literal, physical blow to papal authority that sent shockwaves across medieval Europe. For 3 days, the man who claimed to speak for God was held prisoner, humiliated by the very monarch he had tried to dominate. The psychological impact of this assault on papal dignity cannot be overstated. It was as if the entire concept of sacred authority had been physically assaulted. Though he was eventually freed by local supporters, the damage to his psyche and to papal prestige was irreparable. He died shortly after his release, either from illness or, as many contemporaries believed, from the rage and humiliation of his defeat. Some said he literally died of wounded pride, his ego so inflated that its puncturing proved fatal. But his downfall didn't end with his death. Years later, his enemies had his body exhumed and claimed it reeked of sulfur, a symbolic gesture accusing him of damnation. Even more significantly, when Dante Alighieri wrote his Divine Comedy, he placed Boniface VIII in the 8th circle of hell, the place reserved for corrupt churchmen who had sold their sacred offices for personal gain. Boniface VIII is remembered today as the man who pushed papal arrogance to its absolute breaking point. He saw himself as the ultimate ruler of earth and heaven, but in trying to become a god among men, he nearly destroyed the respect for the papacy altogether. His story is a perfect cautionary tale about what happens when sacred power is wielded without humility. It becomes tyranny cloaked in divinity, and eventually, that tyranny collapses under its own impossible weight.
Don't be fooled by the name, my friends. Pope Innocent III was anything but innocent. Crowned in 1198, he was one of the most powerful popes in history, and arguably one of the most dangerous. Unlike other corrupt pontiffs who indulged in personal pleasures like orgies or gold, Innocent III pursued power on a global scale, wielding it with a ruthlessness that would make medieval warlords seem merciful by comparison. His weapon wasn't lust or greed, it was holy war. Under Innocent III's rule, the papacy transformed from a spiritual institution into what can only be described as an empire of swords. He didn't just preach about the glory of God, he enforced it at the point of a blade, turning Christian faith into a military conquest that left trails of blood across 2 continents.
Innocent III launched the Fourth Crusade in 1202, ostensibly a military campaign meant to retake Jerusalem from Muslim control. It was supposed to be the grand culmination of Christian military might, a holy war that would restore the most sacred city in Christianity to Christian hands. But what actually happened was so shocking, so completely contrary to Christian values, that it remains one of the greatest scandals in church history. The Crusaders never even reached Jerusalem. Instead, in a twist that revealed the true nature of medieval politics, they turned their weapons on Constantinople, the Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire. Think about that for a moment. A supposedly holy war declared by the Pope ended up with Christian soldiers attacking other Christians. In 1204, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople with a savagery that horrified even hardened medieval observers. They looted churches, raped nuns, and stole sacred relics in the name of God. The great library of Constantinople, one of the last repositories of ancient learning, was destroyed. Priceless artifacts were melted down for gold. The city that had stood as a beacon of Christian civilization for nearly 1,000 years was reduced to smoking rubble by soldiers carrying Christian banners. This wasn't just a military disaster, it was a spiritual betrayal of everything Christianity claimed to represent. When word reached Innocent III, he claimed to be outraged by the Crusaders' actions. But here's the telling detail. By the time his condemnation reached the armies, they had already declared victory and sent him a generous share of the spoils of war. The Pope, who had supposedly been horrified by the attack, happily accepted the stolen treasures. But perhaps even darker than the Fourth Crusade was the Albigensian Crusade, a war that Innocent III declared not against distant Muslims, but against fellow Christians within Europe itself. In southern France, a Christian sect called the Cathars had been spreading ideas that threatened the church's authority and wealth. They preached poverty, rejected the elaborate hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and questioned whether the corrupt clergy of their time could truly represent God. Instead of sending theologians to debate these ideas or missionaries to persuade the Cathars through peaceful means, Innocent III sent knights with a simple, chilling message: "Kill them all, God will sort them out." This phrase, attributed to the papal legate Arnauld Amalric, became one of the most infamous quotes in Christian history. In 1209, the city of Béziers was attacked by the crusading army. When soldiers asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics among the population, the response was genocidal in its simplicity: kill them all. Over 20,000 people were slaughtered: men, women, children, babies, in what amounted to the first religious genocide in medieval Europe. Under Innocent III, the Church had declared war on its own people. Heresy was no longer to be corrected through teaching or debate. It was to be punished with complete extermination. The seeds of the Spanish Inquisition were quietly planted during his reign, establishing the precedent that theological differences could be resolved through torture and mass murder. The psychological portrait that emerges from Innocent III is deeply disturbing. Here was a man who claimed to represent the Prince of Peace, yet he orchestrated some of the bloodiest religious conflicts in human history. He spoke of Christian love while authorizing the systematic slaughter of entire populations. He preached about mercy while showing none to anyone who dared question his authority. What makes Innocent III particularly chilling is that he wasn't acting from passion or personal vendetta. His campaigns of violence were calculated, systematic, and carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. He had transformed the papacy into a military organization that used religious authority to justify the most unholy acts. He died in 1216, satisfied with his campaigns and reforms. And while historians acknowledge that he did centralize church power and reshape canon law in ways that lasted for centuries, his legacy remains forever stained with the blood of those he labeled enemies, even when they wore the same cross he claimed to serve. Pope Innocent III didn't just rule the church, he weaponized it. His crusades, launched under banners of purity and salvation, remain among the darkest blots on Christian history, proof that sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as righteousness. And now, my friends, we leave behind the corrupted halls of the Vatican and travel back in time to one of history's greatest mysteries. Picture this. Long ago, where the sands of Iraq now stretch silent and bare, there stood a city unlike any other. Babylon, ancient, proud, and humming with life. It was a city of ziggurats and priests, of kings and scribes, of empires rising beneath stars that watched quietly from above. And at its heart, so the story goes, bloomed a garden that should not have been possible. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a paradise not sprawled across fields, but suspended in the air, layered in ascending terraces, each one bursting with color and life. Imagine towering palms swaying in the desert wind, fragrant myrrh filling the air, vines that curled and draped like green waterfalls cascading down walls of stone. Water, the very essence of life in that arid land, flowing through carefully carved channels, trickling down walls, feeding fruit trees that should never have thrived in that dry, blistering heat. To stand before it, ancient writers claimed, was like seeing a mountain made of gardens, a man-made Eden that rose up from the earth and challenged the very laws of nature, a miracle of engineering wrapped in beauty, a triumph of human imagination over the harsh realities of desert life. But here's the question that has haunted historians, archaeologists, and dreamers alike for over 2,000 years. Did these magnificent gardens really exist? There are no Babylonian tablets that mention them, no inscriptions carved in stone, no ruins we can point to and say with certainty, here they stood. All we have are the accounts of later Greek and Roman writers, men like Strabo and Philo of Byzantium, who described the gardens with breathless awe, but from a distance of centuries. They wrote about something they had never seen, in a city many of them had never visited, describing wonders that may have existed only in the stories passed down through generations of travelers and storytellers. Could something so grand, so seemingly impossible, have simply vanished without a trace? Or worse, could it have never have existed at all, nothing more than the ancient world's most enduring and beautiful lie? And yet the legend endures, refusing to die, refusing to be dismissed as mere fantasy. Perhaps it's because the story behind the gardens is too romantically perfect to let go. The tale goes that King Nebuchadnezzar II, the mighty ruler of Babylon, had married a woman from the distant forested land of Media, possibly Queen Amatis. She had grown up among rolling green hills, cool mountain breezes, and forests that whispered with life. But when she married into the Babylonian court, she found herself in a world of endless heat and dust, flat desert landscapes and brown brick walls stretching to the horizon. The young queen grew homesick, pining for the green hills of her childhood. So the king, moved by love for his melancholy wife, ordered the creation of something unprecedented, a mountain garden in the middle of his desert capital, Not just a courtyard with a few plants, but a massive structure so vast and intricate that it seemed to hang in the air, layered like the hills she missed so desperately. It would have been an offering of greenery and a land of fire, a gift of love wrapped in engineering genius, a promise that even in the harshest desert, beauty could bloom if someone was willing to dream big enough and work hard enough to make the impossible real. This version of the story speaks to something deep in the human heart, the idea that love can move mountains, or in this case, build them where none existed before. But was it real? Greek historians like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus described elaborate terraces stacked like steps to heaven, irrigation systems that lifted water from the Euphrates River to the highest levels of the garden through mechanical devices that seemed almost magical to ancient minds. They wrote with absolute confidence, painting vivid pictures of stone walkways wide enough for chariots, complex irrigation channels hidden beneath lush foliage, and trees planted in deep layers of earth that somehow thrived suspended high above the ground. But here's the problem. These writers were describing something that may have been as mythical to them as it is to us. None of them had visited Babylon during the height of its splendor. Many were writing centuries after the supposed construction of the gardens. By the time they put stylus to papyrus, Babylon was already fading, becoming more legend than reality, more dream than stone. So was this a real architectural marvel that once defied the laws of nature, or was it the ancient world's most enduring and beautiful lie? And yet the legend endures, refusing to die, refusing to be dismissed as mere fantasy.
If the Hanging Gardens were truly one of the most magnificent structures ever built, there's something deeply puzzling about their story, something that has troubled scholars for generations. While later Greek and Roman writers spoke of them in vivid, passionate detail, the Babylonians themselves, the people who supposedly built and lived among these gardens, maintained an almost complete silence about them. Think about how strange this really is. The Babylonians were absolutely meticulous record keepers. They wrote about everything: crops and harvests, taxes and tributes, the dimensions of buildings, the names of architects, the costs of construction projects, even the daily activities of their kings. They carved their achievements in stone and pressed their accomplishments into clay tablets that have survived for thousands of years. Yet nowhere in this vast archive of Babylonian records do we find a single line that confirms the existence of a massive terraced garden rising above their capital city. Not one inscription, not one accounting record, not one temple document that mentions what should have been the crown jewel of their architectural achievements. Even King Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler most often credited with creating the gardens, left behind thousands of cuneiform inscriptions boasting of his accomplishments. He proudly describes temples he built, walls he fortified, palaces he constructed, canals he dug. But never, not once, does he mention a word about building a wonder for his homesick glean. No reference to terraces, no description of an elevated Eden, no proud declaration about defying nature itself. This silence is more than puzzling. It's almost impossible to explain if the gardens truly existed. If Nebuchadnezzar had actually built something as magnificent and unprecedented as the Hanging Gardens, wouldn't he have wanted the world to know about it? Wouldn't such an engineering marvel have been the first thing he'd boast about to future generations? Some historians argue that the gardens might have been destroyed early, vanishing long before Greek writers ever laid eyes on Babylon. Others suggest something even more intriguing, that the gardens were never in Babylon at all, but somewhere else entirely, misattributed by foreign historians trying to reconstruct ancient wonders from fragmentary stories and second-hand accounts. One of the most compelling alternative theories emerged in the 20th century from Dr. Stephanie Daly, a British Assyriologist who spent decades studying ancient Mesopotamian texts. After careful analysis of the evidence, she proposed something radical. The gardens were real, but they were built in Nineveh, not Babylon, by the Assyrian king Sennacherib about a century before Nebuchadnezzar's time. Nineveh, the glittering capital of the Assyrian Empire, sat farther north along the Tigris River. And here's where the story gets interesting. Unlike Babylon's mysterious silence, Sennacherib left behind detailed records of his accomplishments. In his inscriptions, he describes magnificent palace gardens filled with exotic plants and fruit trees, watered by a massive aqueduct system that brought water from mountains 50 kilometers away. He even mentions using a water lifting screw, the same technology that Greek authors would later attribute to the Hanging Gardens. Could it be that the wonders described by Greek historians were based not on Babylonian achievements, but on garbled tales of Assyrian engineering, misunderstood and misattributed across centuries of storytelling? Dr. Daly also pointed out something fascinating about ancient language. The word Babylon didn't always refer to a specific city. Assyrians sometimes used it to mean gateway of the gods, referring to any sacred or important city in their empire. In this interpretation, Nineveh could have been considered another Babylon, and the gardens never moved at all, only the understanding of where Babylon actually was. This theory doesn't erase the gardens, it relocates them. And in doing so, it explains both the silence of Babylonian records and the detailed descriptions of Greek writers. It suggests that one of history's greatest wonders wasn't imagined, just misunderstood, like a game of telephone played across centuries of ancient scholarship. But there's another possibility that's equally intriguing. Maybe the gardens never existed physically at all. Perhaps they were always symbolic, a myth born from humanity's eternal longing for paradise, for the possibility that even in the harshest desert, beauty could bloom through human ingenuity and love. Maybe the story of the Hanging Gardens represents something deeper than engineering. Maybe it's about hope. The hope that impossible things are possible, that love can indeed move mountains, that human creativity can transform the most barren landscapes into places of wonder.
If the Hanging Gardens were real, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, they represent one of the most astounding engineering achievements in human history. Just imagine the challenge, creating a mountaintop garden in the middle of a desert, not just small plants and flowers, but full-grown trees, sprawling shrubs, and cascading vines, all suspended high above the ground in blazing heat with virtually no rainfall. To keep such a garden alive and thriving, ancient engineers would have needed far more than green thumbs. They would have needed nothing short of genius. The Greek accounts give us tantalizing clues about how this miracle might have been achieved. They describe terraces stacked like enormous steps, built atop vaulted foundations made of baked brick and waterproof asphalt. The soil wasn't just spread thin like a modern rooftop garden. It was layered thick and deep, rich enough and substantial enough to support the root systems of massive trees. But the real marvel, the engineering challenge that would have tested ancient minds to their limits, was the irrigation system. How do you lift water from a river to the top of a multi-story garden in an age without electric pumps or modern machinery? The answer might lie in a device that was known to ancient engineers, but rarely used on such an ambitious scale: the Archimedes screw, or something similar. Picture a large spiral tube housed inside a cylinder, turned by hand or foot power, that could raise water upward through rotation. If the Babylonians or Assyrians had perfected such technology, and there's reason to believe they had the knowledge to build it, it could have created a continuous flow of water, feeding streams that cascaded from one level to the next like an artificial mountain brook. But the system would have been far more complex than a simple water lifting device. It would have required a network of channels carved through stone, gutters hidden beneath the foliage, drainage systems to prevent the structure from being waterlogged, and maintenance crews who understood both engineering and horticulture. Workers would have tended to pipes and pumps as carefully as they tended to plants and trees.
And all of this elaborate infrastructure would have been concealed beneath a blanket of leaves and blossoms, creating the illusion that the garden breathed and flourished on its own, sustained by some divine magic rather than human engineering. To visitors approaching from the desert, it would have seemed impossible. A floating forest, a hill sculpted from water and willpower, something no other city on Earth could claim. The psychological impact on ancient visitors must have been overwhelming. Remember, these were people who understood that plants needed soil, water, and favorable conditions to survive. To see massive trees thriving high above the ground, to hear the sound of flowing water in the middle of a desert, to walk through cool, shaded groves where no grove should have been able to exist, it would have seemed like stepping into the realm of the gods themselves. But could such advanced technology really have existed in ancient Mesopotamia? We often underestimate what ancient civilizations were capable of achieving when they had unlimited royal resources, decades to plan and build, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of engineers and architects. The Mesopotamians had already mastered complex irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland. They understood hydraulics well enough to build functioning aqueducts and canal networks. They knew how to work with waterproof materials and create structures that could withstand both the weight of soil and the pressure of flowing water. What made the hanging gardens so wondrous, if they existed, wasn't just their beauty. It was the quiet message they carried, that even in the harshest environment, even in a land where water was precious and green things struggled to survive, human ingenuity could create paradise. They represented the triumph of imagination over limitation, love over landscape, and engineering over impossibility. Whether they stood in Babylon, Nineveh, or only in the realm of dreams, the Hanging Gardens symbolize something profound about human nature, our refusal to accept that beauty is impossible, our determination to create wonder even in the most challenging circumstances. The ancient engineers who might have built them understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern world, that the most impressive achievements aren't always the biggest or the most practical, but the ones that capture the imagination and prove that impossible things can become possible when human creativity meets human determination. Even if every stone is crumbled and every vine is withered, even if no trace remains in the desert sands, the Hanging Gardens continue to bloom in the most fertile ground of all, the human imagination, where they've been growing for over 2,000 years, inspiring new generations to believe that beauty can flourish anywhere we're willing to plant it.
Beyond all the archaeological debates and engineering theories, the story of the Hanging Gardens is also something much simpler and more human, a love story that has endured for millennia. According to ancient tradition, King Nebuchadnezzar II didn't build these magnificent gardens out of pride, or as a temple to the gods, or as a display of imperial power. He built them for one person, Amytis, his queen, a woman far from home who was slowly breaking apart from loneliness. Amytis was said to be a princess from Media, a land of rolling green hills, cool mountain breezes, and forests that whispered with life. Her homeland was everything that Babylon was not: verdant, temperate, alive with the sound of flowing streams and rustling leaves. When she married the king of Babylon and came to live in his desert capital, she entered a world that must have felt like an alien planet. Imagine her daily experience in Babylon, waking each morning to endless flatlands stretching to the horizon, brown brick walls baking in relentless heat, dust storms that turned the sky yellow, and a sun that rarely relented in its merciless intensity. For a woman raised among green meadows and shaded groves, it must have been like living in a beautiful prison. Ancient accounts describe her growing melancholy, a homesickness so deep that it threatened her health and happiness. She would stand on the palace walls, looking out over the flat desert landscape, perhaps trying to imagine the hills of her childhood hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. The king, watching his beloved wife waste away with longing, decided to do something unprecedented. He ordered the creation of a mountain in the middle of his city, not one made of earth and stone alone, but one woven with vines, scattered with blossoms, and breathing with the sound of flowing water. He called upon his greatest architects, his most skilled engineers, his most knowledgeable gardeners, and thousands of workers to create something that had never existed before, a piece of her homeland sculpted in the very heart of his desert empire. Picture the conversations that might have taken place between the king and his architects. "I want hills," he might have said, "but we have no hills. I want forests, but we have no trees that can survive here. I want the sound of mountain streams, but we are surrounded by desert. Make it happen anyway." The result, if the stories are true, was a monument not of conquest, but of comfort, not of power, but of love. Stone by stone, level by level, they raised an artificial mountain and filled it with every green and growing thing that could remind a homesick queen of the world she had lost. Every terrace was planned with her in mind, every tree chosen to echo the forests of her childhood, every stream designed to recreate the music of her homeland's rivers. This version of the story, whether historically accurate or beautifully imagined, speaks to something universal about human nature. How far would you go to ease the suffering of someone you love? What would you build? What would you sacrifice? What impossibility would you attempt if it could bring happiness to a person whose joy meant more to you than your own? The hanging gardens in this telling become more than architecture. They become a quiet rebellion against the harsh realities of geography and climate. In a world shaped by war and empire, by conquest and domination, someone chose to build something not to intimidate enemies, but to heal a broken heart. Not to demonstrate power, but to demonstrate devotion. No Babylonian text records Queen Amytis by name. No tablets speak of her sorrow or her king's response to it. But the tale has echoed through history precisely because it's so easy to believe, so fundamentally human that it feels true even if it can't be proven. Because isn't this exactly what love does? It looks at impossible situations and refuses to accept them. It sees someone suffering and says, "I will move heaven and earth to make this better." It transforms practical limitations into creative challenges and finds ways to build paradise even in the most unlikely places. Even if the gardens never existed, even if Queen Amytis was a figure of legend rather than history, the love story that supposedly inspired them remains real and powerful. Because somewhere in the human heart, we all understand the impulse to create beauty for those we care about, to build something lasting that says your happiness matters enough to change the world. In that sense, the hanging gardens are still blooming, not in the desert sands of ancient Iraq, but in every act of love that refuses to accept that impossible things must remain impossible.
If the Hanging Gardens once truly existed as one of the most magnificent structures ever built by human hands, what happened to them? How does something so grand, so carefully constructed, so lovingly maintained, simply disappear from history without leaving a trace? Great wonders often don't fall with dramatic crashes or spectacular collapses. Instead, they fade slowly, quietly, over generations, like dreams dissolving in the morning light. Time doesn't just erase buildings, it buries them in layers of dust and silence, transforming living marvels into archaeological mysteries. Babylon itself, once the jewel of Mesopotamia and the pride of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, suffered this slow death by 1,000 cuts. After the fall of Nebuchadnezzar's dynasty, the city passed through the hands of one conqueror after another. Persians, Greeks, Parthians, each leaving their mark,
but none maintaining the splendor that earlier kings had built. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, would have required constant, expensive maintenance. Remember, we're talking about a complex ecosystem suspended high above the ground in one of the world's harshest climates. The irrigation system alone would have needed teams of skilled workers to keep the water flowing, to repair channels damaged by weather or time, to ensure that the delicate balance between moisture and drainage continued to support plant life. When political priorities changed, when budgets tightened, when new rulers focused their attention on different projects or different cities, the gardens would have been among the first casualties. Unlike temples or palaces, which could survive neglect for decades or centuries, a garden needs daily attention. Stop watering it, stop pruning it, stop caring for it, and within a few seasons, it becomes a lifeless relic. Babylon's bricks and stones were systematically looted over the centuries to construct new cities. Earthquakes, which are common in that region, would have been devastating to a multi-level structure held together by ancient mortar and dependent on precise engineering. Sandstorms, flooding, and the relentless erosion of desert wind gradually buried what remained under layers of sediment. By the time Alexander the Great arrived in Babylon in the 4th century BCE, the city was already fading from its former glory. Alexander dreamed of making Babylon the capital of his new empire, of restoring it to its former magnificence, but death claimed him before these dreams could take shape. Without a patron who understood and valued its unique wonders, the city was left to slowly crumble. No one knows exactly when the gardens vanished, if they were ever there at all. Perhaps they were deliberately dismantled, their materials repurposed for other construction projects. Perhaps they collapsed from neglect, their complex irrigation system failing and their elevated soil gradually washing away. Perhaps they were damaged beyond repair by earthquake or warfare and simply abandoned rather than rebuilt. Or perhaps, as some scholars now believe, they never stood in Babylon at all, existing only in the pages of foreign writers who had heard stories too fascinating to question, but too distant to verify. The absence of physical evidence is heavy and haunting. It lingers like the space where a great tree once stood, roots gone, but the shape of its shade still remembered by those who once rested beneath it. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of Babylon's grand ziggurats and palaces, its famous Ishtar Gate and processional way. But despite decades of careful excavation and analysis, no trace of the legendary gardens has ever been definitively identified. Every promising lead has turned into disappointment. Every potential site has yielded evidence of other structures, but never the terraced paradise described in ancient texts. This absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence, suggesting either that the gardens were built somewhere else entirely, or that they were constructed in a way that left no permanent archaeological signature, or that they never existed outside the realm of imagination and storytelling. Even if they once towered in reality, physical and magnificent and impossible, the Hanging Gardens have now passed into a different kind of truth, the truth of memory, myth, and longing. We search the ruins not just for bricks and pipes and ancient soil, but for proof that such wonder was possible, that humanity has always dreamed of beauty that reaches upward toward impossible things. Maybe that's what makes their disappearance so haunting. Not that they vanished, but that they might never have existed at all. And yet we still believe, we still search, we still tell their story, because the mind, like the desert, is a place where beautiful, impossible things can still bloom. The Hanging Gardens remind us that some wonders live not in stone and mortar, but in the spaces between what we know and what we hope. in the fertile ground where imagination meets possibility, where love meets engineering, where human dreams refuse to be constrained by the limitations of reality.
And now, my friends, let's journey even further back in time, to the very foundations of human civilization, to understand one of the most revolutionary concepts ever developed by our species: money. Before coins jingled in pockets and bills changed hands at markets, before digital numbers flowed across screens at the speed of light, there was a time when humanity had no money at all. Yet somehow, trade still flourished. It was a world built entirely on barter, where goods and services were exchanged directly, person to person, need to need. Picture a farmer with a surplus of grain approaching a fisherman by a river. "I'll give you 20 measures of wheat," the farmer might say, "in exchange for enough fish to feed my family for a week." No coins, no currency, no complex financial instruments, just two people with different resources meeting in the middle to satisfy each other's needs. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else, this system worked reasonably well. The potter could swap bowls and jars for woven cloth from the weaver. The blacksmith could trade iron tools for leather goods from the tanner. The shepherd could exchange wool for vegetables from the gardener. It was direct, personal, and built on relationships that extended far beyond any single transaction. But as human communities grew larger and more complex, the limitations of pure barter became increasingly obvious and frustrating. The fundamental problem was what economists now call the coincidence of wants. The challenge of finding someone who both has what you want and wants what you have at the exact moment when you both want to make a trade. Imagine this scenario. You're a shepherd with 3 goats, and you desperately need salt to preserve meat for the winter. You find a salt merchant, but he has no need for goats. He already has more livestock than he can handle. The deal falls apart, not because your goats aren't valuable, or because salt isn't needed, but because your timing and his needs don't align. This is the fundamental inefficiency that plagued barter systems everywhere. As villages grew into towns and towns into cities, as trade networks extended across greater distances and involved more specialized crafts, bartering became increasingly clumsy, slow, and impractical. People began to realize they needed something that could stand in for value itself, something that could be universally accepted, easily stored, and reliably exchanged for other goods later. The solution wasn't obvious, and different cultures arrived at it through different paths. But gradually, across the ancient world, societies began to lean on objects that were easy to measure, hard to fake, and universally desired. Sometimes that meant livestock. A goat might be worth 2 sheep or 10 chickens, creating a living currency that could walk itself to market. In other cultures, it meant salt, so precious and necessary for food preservation that it became synonymous with value itself. The word salary comes from salarium, the Latin term for the salt rations paid to Roman soldiers. The phrase "worth his salt" echoes this ancient connection between a mineral and human worth. Other societies turned to tools and weapons as stores of value. Polished axe heads in the Stone Age, bronze blades in ancient China, these items were accepted in trade not necessarily to be used, but because they represented clear, measurable value that could be exchanged for other goods later. These early forms of proto-currency weren't yet money in the sense we understand today, but they were crucial stepping stones between pure barter and modern financial systems. They allowed people to begin thinking about value in abstract terms. The idea that a piece of metal or a beautiful shell could represent something larger: time, labor, security, or future possibility. More importantly, they introduced the revolutionary concept that value could be stored and passed along. Instead of having to consume or trade everything immediately, people could accumulate wealth in portable forms, save for the future, and engage in more complex, long-distance trade relationships.
What's fascinating is that this transition happened independently in cultures all around the world, suggesting that the move from barter to symbolic currency represents a fundamental stage in human social development. From the cowrie shells of ancient Africa to the cacao beans of Mesoamerica, from the bronze cools of early China to the cattle-based wealth of pastoral societies, humans everywhere discovered that abstract symbols of value could revolutionize how they related to each other and to resources. But perhaps most importantly, these early currency systems were built on something that remains at the heart of all economic activity today: trust. Trust that the other person would accept your shell or tool or salt in exchange for something you needed. Trust that the community would continue to recognize these symbols as valuable. Trust that the system itself would endure beyond any individual transaction. Before there were coins, before numbers were stamped on precious metals, there was a far more ancient and fundamental truth that people have always needed ways to trust each other across time and space. Currency, in its earliest form, was simply a promise made tangible, not in paper or metal, but in the basic human need to believe that cooperation and exchange could make everyone's life better.
As human societies expanded and trade networks stretched across continents, a quiet but revolutionary transformation began to take place. Communities started adopting objects of agreed-upon value, not because these things were immediately useful, but because everyone collectively agreed they were worth something. This was the birth of what we might call proto-currency, the first real stepping stones toward money as we know it today. One of the earliest and most widespread forms of this symbolic currency was the cowrie shell. Small, smooth, naturally beautiful objects with a pearly white surface that seemed to glow in sunlight. These shells came from the warm waters of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, making them exotic and rare in inland regions, which only added to their perceived value. But cowrie shells had practical advantages that made them ideal for early currency systems. They were naturally beautiful, making them desirable as ornaments even beyond their economic function. They were extremely difficult to counterfeit. Try as you might, you couldn't manufacture a convincing fake cowrie shell with ancient technology. They were small and lightweight, making them easy to carry in quantity. And perhaps most importantly, they were durable, able to survive years of handling and travel without degrading. Cowrie shells began appearing in trade networks that stretched across vast regions, from East Africa to China, from Southeast Asia to the interior of continental Africa. In some African kingdoms, royal treasuries stored enormous bags of cowries like modern banks store gold, representing wealth that could fund armies, build monuments, or secure political alliances. The psychological shift represented by cowrie currency was profound. For the first time in human history, people were accepting objects in trade not because those objects had immediate practical value, but because they trusted that other people would accept them later. It was a collective act of faith in abstract value that required unprecedented cooperation across large populations. Meanwhile, in ancient Mesopotamia, people were developing a different approach to symbolic currency. Instead of shells or beads, they used measured silver. Not coins yet, but carefully weighed lumps of precious metal that could be trusted to hold consistent value across time and distance. Merchants carried portable scales to weigh silver in shekels, and contracts written in cuneiform recorded exact amounts with the precision of modern financial documents. Silver had intrinsic value because of its rarity and usefulness in jewelry and religious objects, but its use as currency represented something more sophisticated than simple barter. Urban economies where accounting and record-keeping were essential needed something more precise than cowrie shells or cattle, and weighed silver provided that precision. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs developed yet another approach to early currency: cacao beans. These weren't just used to make chocolate, they were counted, stored, and protected like money.
The system was remarkably sophisticated. 10 beans might buy a rabbit, 100 could purchase a small woven cloak, and the beans were small enough to make precise change for smaller transactions. What made cacao beans particularly interesting as currency was that they had both symbolic and practical value. You could use them to buy things, but in a pinch, you could also eat them. This dual nature provided a kind of insurance against economic collapse. Even if the monetary system failed, the currency itself retained survival value. In the Philippines, long before any European influence, local communities were using gold rings and bars called piloncitos in their markets. These small, precisely shaped pieces of gold were standardized enough to function as reliable currency, while being valuable enough to represent significant wealth in compact form. In various parts of Africa, iron tools, hoes, spears, and knives were accepted in trade not necessarily to be used as tools, but because they represented consistent, measurable value that everyone understood. These tool currencies created interesting economic dynamics where the symbols of wealth were also potentially useful for agriculture or defense. What connected all these diverse currency systems across different cultures and continents was a fundamental shift in how humans thought about value. For the first time, value didn't need to be immediate or personal. It could be symbolic, abstract, transferable. A small shell or shiny piece of metal could represent something much larger: time invested in work, labor performed for others, security stored for the future, or possibilities yet to be realized. These early forms of currency changed how people interacted with each other in profound ways. Now someone didn't have to trade directly for something they needed immediately. They could accept something valuable today and use it weeks or months later to get something completely different. This created flexibility in economic relationships that had never existed before. Trust began to flow through tokens, objects, and agreed-upon symbols rather than just personal relationships. Money was no longer just about survival or immediate needs. It had become a language that could be spoken across cultures, a universal translator that allowed different communities to understand each other's needs and desires. The stage was being set for one of the most important developments in human history. The moment when someone would take these abstract symbols of value and stamp them with official authority, transforming informal agreements about worth into formal guarantees of value backed by organized power.
As trade networks expanded across continents and civilizations grew in complexity, the need for more reliable and standardized forms of money became undeniable. Trusting in cacao beans, cowrie shells, or weighed silver worked well enough for local trade, but these systems had limitations when it came to long-distance commerce and large-scale economic activity. What the ancient world needed was uniformity, money that didn't just represent value, but carried the weight of authority behind it. This need led to one of the most significant economic revolutions in human history: the rise of metal as standardized currency. Metals like gold, silver, copper, and bronze had already been used in trade for centuries because they possessed ideal properties for storing and transferring wealth. They were rare enough to be valuable, durable enough to last for generations, and could be melted down and reshaped without losing their essential worth. But the use of metals as currency was initially inconsistent and problematic. A piece of silver accepted in one region might be questioned, tested, weighed, and evaluated all over again in another area. Travelers and merchants never knew whether their wealth would be trusted when they arrived in foreign territories. The solution came from an unlikely source: the guarantee of authority. Ancient rulers realized that they could solve the problem of trust by stamping metal with official marks that certified weight, purity, and authenticity. This wasn't just a practical innovation, it was a declaration of power, a way for governments to literally put their stamp on economic activity. Some of the earliest known coins came from the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, around 650 BCE. These revolutionary pieces were made of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that was found in local rivers. But what made them special wasn't their metal content. It was the official stamp pressed into their surface. Each Lydian coin bore the image of a lion's head, the royal emblem of King Aliades. This wasn't decorative artwork. It was an official guarantee. The stamp meant that the king himself vouched for the weight and purity of the metal. For the first time in history, the value of money came not just from the material it was made of, but from the authority that backed it. This was a revolutionary concept that changed everything about how people thought about wealth and trade. A coin wasn't just a piece of precious metal. It was a promise made by a government, a guarantee that could be trusted even by people who had never met the king who issued it. The power of the state was literally stamped into every transaction. The idea spread like wildfire across the ancient world. Greek city-states began minting their own coins, each featuring symbols of local identity and pride. Athens stamped its coins with owls, sacred to the goddess Athena. Aegina used sea turtles, reflecting its maritime power. Corinth featured the winged horse Pegasus. Each coin became a miniature piece of propaganda carried from hand to hand across the Mediterranean. Greek coins weren't just currency. They were cultural ambassadors that spread the reputation and influence of their cities wherever trade networks reached. But more than that, they represented a new kind of trust. Not trust in individuals or personal relationships, but trust in institutions, in governments, in the organized power of civilized society. Over time, rulers across the ancient world discovered something profound about controlling currency. If you could decide what counted as money, you could influence trade, raise armies, fund construction projects, and shape the entire economy of your region. Money became both a tool of commerce and an instrument of power. In Persia, King Darius II introduced gold coins called darics, stamped with an image of the king himself holding a bow and arrow. These coins circulated across one of the largest empires in human history, connecting lands from Egypt to India with a single, consistent form of money that carried the authority of Persian imperial power. Meanwhile, in China, early coins took on distinctive and symbolic shapes. Spades representing agriculture, knives representing craftsmanship, and eventually round discs with square holes in the center. These could be strung together on cords and worn like wallets around the waist, but their shapes also carried cosmic significance. The round form representing heaven and the square hole symbolizing earth, uniting the celestial and terrestrial in every transaction. The act of minting money fundamentally transformed how people experienced value and authority. Coins became trusted tools, not just for local trade, but for long-distance exchange that could span continents. Soldiers were paid in them. Taxes were collected through them. Markets organized around them. With every stamped image, whether of gods, kings, or mythical beasts, money whispered the same revolutionary message. This has value, not just because of what it's made of, but because we, the authorities, say it does, and because you believe it. The transformation of money from simple objects to stamped authority was revolutionary, but it represented only the beginning of a much larger change in how human societies organized themselves economically and politically. What's truly fascinating about this transition is how quickly it spread across the ancient world once the concept was established. Within a few centuries, the basic idea of official coinage had reached civilizations that had no direct contact with each other. From the Greeks to the Indians, from the Persians to the early Chinese kingdoms, rulers everywhere seemed to grasp instinctively that controlling the money supply meant controlling their people's economic lives. But this wasn't just about economics, it was about psychology. When a merchant in Athens accepted a coin from Syracuse, he wasn't just trusting the silver content.
He was participating in a complex web of faith that stretched across the Mediterranean. He believed that the government of Syracuse would continue to exist, that other people would continue to accept their currency, and that the whole system wouldn't collapse tomorrow. The stamping of coins also began what we might recognize as the earliest form of mass media. Every coin carried messages, sometimes literal text, sometimes symbolic images, always political propaganda. When Alexander the Great's coin showed him wearing the horns of the god Ammon, he wasn't just minting money, he was broadcasting his claim to divine status across his entire empire. Every transaction became a moment of political education. This shift from commodity money to fiat currency, money that derived its value from governmental authority rather than intrinsic worth, required a level of social trust that had never existed before in human history. People had to believe not just in the metal, but in the institution behind it. They had to trust that distant rulers would honor the promises stamped into their coins. The implications went far beyond individual transactions. Standardized currency made possible the growth of professional armies paid in regular wages rather than plunder. It enabled the development of complex taxation systems that could support massive public works. It allowed for the emergence of banking and credit, since debts could now be calculated in universally understood units. But perhaps most importantly, official coinage created the first truly abstract wealth. A bag of coins wasn't valuable because of what you could do with the metal itself. It was valuable because of what those coins could be exchanged for. This abstraction of value would prove to be one of humanity's most powerful and dangerous innovations, creating possibilities for both unprecedented prosperity and devastating financial crises. As we trace the evolution of money from these ancient stamped metals to our modern digital currencies, we can see that the fundamental challenge hasn't changed. How do we create and maintain the trust necessary for complex economic systems to function? The answer, as ancient rulers discovered, lies not in the physical properties of money itself, but in the institutions and relationships that give it meaning. The revolution of official coinage didn't just change how people bought and sold goods, it changed how they thought about value, authority, and the relationship between individual wealth and state power. In many ways, we're still living with the consequences of decisions made by ancient kings who first decided to stamp their authority into pieces of metal.
When we talk about currency systems that truly change the world, no civilization achieved what Rome accomplished with its monetary innovations. For the Romans, money wasn't just a means of exchange, it was the lifeblood of empire, a tool of conquest as powerful as any legion. By the time of the Roman Republic, coins had become absolutely essential to daily life throughout the Mediterranean world. The Romans didn't just adopt existing currency systems, they revolutionized them, creating a complex, sophisticated monetary network that could support an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. The Roman approach to money was characteristically practical and systematic. They developed a multi-metal currency system based on bronze for everyday transactions, silver for more substantial commerce, and gold for the largest exchanges and international trade. Their earliest coin, the Os Rudis, was literally just a chunk of bronze, heavy and crude, but over time, Roman monetary technology became incredibly refined. The silver denarius became one of history's most famous and successful coins. For centuries, it served as the backbone of Roman commerce, used to pay soldiers' salaries, collect taxes, and facilitate trade across continents. But what made the denarius truly revolutionary wasn't just its silver content, it was what the Romans put on it. Roman coins became the world's first systematic propaganda campaign. One side typically featured Roman religious or cultural symbols. gods, goddesses, figures representing victory or prosperity. The other side bore the face of the current emperor, were important political figures. This meant that every single commercial transaction was also a moment of political messaging. Think about the psychological impact of this system. A farmer in Gaul buying grain with a Roman denarius wasn't just making a purchase, he was handling an object that reminded him who ruled his world. A merchant in Alexandria accepting Roman currency was acknowledging the authority of distant Caesar. The emperor's face was literally pressed into the hands of millions of people across the known world. But Roman currency innovation went far beyond propaganda. As the empire expanded, Rome absorbed and adapted the monetary systems of conquered territories. They didn't simply impose Roman coins everywhere. Instead, they created a flexible system that allowed local currencies to continue operating under Roman oversight. This brought consistency to trade while respecting regional economic traditions. The complexity of the Roman monetary system was staggering. Different regions used different denominations, various mints operated across the empire, and the government constantly adjusted the metal content and design of coins to meet changing economic and political needs. Managing this system required a level of administrative sophistication that wouldn't be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. However, even mighty Rome discovered that controlling money could be a double-edged sword. As the empire faced increasing military pressure from barbarian invasions and internal political chaos, emperors began debasing the currency, mixing less precious metal into silver and gold coins to stretch their resources further. This created one of history's first major inflation crises. The denarius, once trusted across the known world, gradually lost its silver content and its value. People began hoarding old coins and refusing newer ones. Prices skyrocketed, trade networks broke down, and public confidence in Roman authority eroded along with the currency. The psychological impact of currency debasement cannot be overstated. When people could no longer trust Roman money, they began to question Roman power itself. The decline of Roman currency both reflected and accelerated the decline of Roman civilization. Yet even as the Western Roman Empire collapsed, Roman coins continued to circulate for centuries. They showed up in archaeological sites as far away as India and Scandinavia, evidence of trade networks that survived long after the legions had been withdrawn. Roman currency had become so trusted, so widely accepted, that it functioned as an international standard even when the government that issued it no longer existed. The Roman monetary legacy extended far beyond the coins themselves. They established principles that still govern modern currency systems: the importance of government backing, the need for standardization across large territories, the use of money as a tool of political communication, and the recognition that currency stability was essential for economic prosperity. When medieval European kingdoms began developing their own monetary systems, they consistently looked back to Roman models. The word mint comes from the Roman temple of Juno Moneta, where coins were first systematically produced. Terms like salary, from Roman salt rations, and money itself, from the same temple, entered languages across Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Rome demonstrated both the power and the danger of fiat currency, monies whose value depends entirely on government authority and public trust. This lesson would be forgotten and relearned repeatedly throughout history, from the collapse of the assignat during the French Revolution, to the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, to modern cryptocurrency experiments. The Romans proved that currency could be an instrument of empire, but they also showed that empires themselves could be undermined by the failure of their monetary systems.
While Rome was building its empire through standardized silver and bronze, the ancient civilizations of Asia were quietly developing their own revolutionary approaches to money.
innovations that were often more sophisticated and, in many cases, far more enduring than anything Europe would produce for centuries. In China, the evolution of currency took a completely different path from the Mediterranean world. Chinese money began not with round coins, but with objects shaped like the tools that people used every day. There was spade money, cast in bronze to look like agricultural implements. Knife money that resembled the blades craftsmen used for their work. These weren't just symbolic representations, they connected currency directly to the labor and productivity that created real wealth. As Chinese society became more complex and trade networks expanded, practical considerations led to the development of what would become one of history's most enduring coin designs. Round bronze pieces with square holes in the center. This wasn't just a practical innovation that allowed coins to be strung together on cords for easy carrying. It was deeply symbolic. The Chinese saw profound meaning in this design. The round shape represented heaven, the celestial realm of perfection and eternity. The square hole symbolized earth, the physical world of humans and practical concerns. Every transaction united the cosmic and the terrestrial, the spiritual and the material. When you spent money in ancient China, you were participating in a philosophical statement about the harmony between different levels of existence. This design proved so effective and meaningful that Chinese coins retained essentially the same form for over 2,000 years through dozens of dynasties and countless political upheavals. While European currencies changed constantly with new rulers and kingdoms, Chinese money provided a stability that helped unify the largest population on Earth under a consistent economic system. But China's most revolutionary monetary innovation wouldn't emerge for several more centuries, and when it did, it would fundamentally change human understanding of what money could be. Chinese inventors would create the world's first paper currency, but that breakthrough was still in the future during this ancient period. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, a different approach to currency was taking shape. As early as the 6th century BCE, small silver pieces called punch-marked coins were circulating throughout the region. Unlike the coins of Greece or Rome, which featured portraits of rulers, Indian currency was stamped with symbols from nature and religion: suns, elephants, hills, trees. This reflected a fundamentally different philosophy about the relationship between political power and economic value. Indian rulers didn't need to put their faces on money to legitimize their authority. Instead, currency was seen as connected to the natural and spiritual forces that governed the universe. Money was sacred, but it was sacred because of its connection to cosmic order, not because of any individual ruler's authority. The vast trade network, known as the Silk Road, created fascinating interactions between these different monetary traditions. Along routes that stretched from China to the Mediterranean, coins of Chinese emperors, Roman Caesars, Persian kings, and Indian rulers all passed from hand to hand. Merchants, monks, and caravans carried not just goods, but monetary ideas across continents. This created the world's first truly international currency exchange. A Chinese trader might accept Roman gold in payment for silk, then use that gold to buy Indian spices, then trade those spices for Persian silver. The Silk Road became a laboratory for experiments in cross-cultural monetary systems. In the eastern regions of this network, currency took on additional dimensions that weren't present in Western systems. Money became part of religious rituals, incorporated into offerings and ceremonies. Some coins were never meant to be spent. They were created specifically to be buried with the dead, burned as offerings or given as gifts to demonstrate respect or affection. This spiritual dimension of Asian currency systems created a very different relationship between people and their money. While Western coins were primarily tools for economic exchange, Eastern currencies often served multiple functions simultaneously: economic, religious, social, and philosophical. The result was monetary systems that were more resilient and longer-lasting than their Western counterparts. When empires fell in Asia, their currency systems often continued operating because they were embedded in cultural and spiritual practices that transcended political boundaries. Money had become part of the fabric of civilization itself. These Asian innovations in currency design and philosophy would eventually influence monetary development worldwide. But more immediately, they demonstrated that there were many different ways to solve the fundamental problem of creating trusted systems of exchange. The solutions that worked best were those that aligned with the deeper values and beliefs of the societies that used them. This lesson remains relevant today as we grapple with new forms of digital currency and global financial systems. The most successful monetary innovations aren't just technical improvements. They're systems that connect with fundamental human needs for trust, meaning, and community.
By the time metal coins have been circulating for over 1,000 years, carrying out the business of empire and trade across continents, another revolution was quietly brewing in China. In the bustling markets and counting houses of the Tang and Song dynasties, merchants and scholars were beginning to experiment with an idea so radical that it would fundamentally transform human understanding of what money could be. The idea was simple in concept, but revolutionary in implications. Money didn't have to be heavy. It could be light. It could be written. The first steps toward paper money emerged from practical necessity rather than theoretical innovation. By the 7th century CE, Chinese merchants engaged in long-distance trade were facing a serious logistical problem. Transporting large quantities of metal coins across vast distances was dangerous, expensive, and cumbersome. A merchant traveling from Beijing to Canton might need to carry thousands of bronze coins, creating a security nightmare and slowing travel to a crawl. The solution emerged organically from the merchant community itself. Wealthy traders and established lending houses began issuing what we might recognize as the first promissory notes. Instead of hauling heavy bags of silver across mountain passes and river valleys, a merchant could deposit his coins with a trusted associate in one city and receive a written receipt that could be redeemed for equivalent value in another location. These early paper instruments weren't official currency. They were private contracts between specific individuals. But they represented a conceptual breakthrough that would change everything. For the first time in human history, value was being represented not by the physical properties of an object, but by the information written on a piece of paper. The Chinese government initially viewed these private paper instruments with suspicion, as governments often do when they see alternatives to their official monetary systems. But by the 11th century CE, during the Song dynasty, the advantages of paper money had become impossible to ignore. The government began issuing the world's first official paper currency, known as jiaozi. These weren't just pieces of paper with numbers written on them. They were sophisticated financial instruments, printed with official seals, expiration dates, and intricate patterns designed to prevent counterfeiting. The Chinese had essentially invented what we now recognize as modern banknotes, complete with anti-fraud measures over 600 years before paper money appeared anywhere else in the world. While Europe was still conducting business with heavy gold and silver coins, China was trading with slips of printed paper, backed by nothing more than imperial authority and public trust. It was an intellectual leap that required a complete reconceptualization of what money fundamentally was. But this revolution came with unprecedented risks. Metal coins had intrinsic value. They were made of materials that could be melted down and repurposed, even if the government that issued them collapsed. Paper money, however, was valuable only because the government said it was valuable. This required an entirely new kind of trust between citizens and their rulers. The psychological challenge was enormous. People had to believe not just in the physical object they held in their hands, but in the invisible promise that piece of paper represented. They had to trust that the government would continue to exist, that it would honor its commitments, and that other people would continue to accept these paper promises as valuable. When this trust was maintained, paper money proved incredibly efficient. It was lighter, easier to transport, and could be produced in whatever denominations were needed for different types of transactions. Large-scale trade and government finance became vastly more sophisticated when freed from the constraints of metallic currency. But when trust broke down, the results could be catastrophic. Chinese history includes several episodes of hyperinflation, where overprinting of paper money led to complete economic collapse. The Yuan dynasty, under Mongol rule, expanded paper money across their vast empire, but eventually printed so much that it became worthless, contributing to the dynasty's downfall. Marco Polo, arriving in China during the 13th century, was absolutely stunned by what he witnessed. He described the paper money system with awe and disbelief, noting that Kublai Khan's notes held power equal to the coin of the realm. To the European mind, it seemed like alchemy, somehow transforming worthless paper into gold through nothing more than imperial decree. But the Chinese had realized something profound that Europe wouldn't fully understand for centuries. Money was never really about the physical object. It was about the shared belief in that object's value. Paper money simply made this abstract reality visible and undeniable. This innovation would eventually spread westward along trade routes, but it would take European civilizations hundreds of years to fully embrace the concept. The Chinese had leaped centuries ahead in monetary technology, creating the foundation for modern financial systems that we still use today. In many ways, every credit card transaction, every bank transfer, every digital payment we make today is a descendant of those first Chinese paper notes. Proof that money is ultimately just information, and information can take many forms.
As trade routes stretched across continents and economies grew increasingly complex, merchants and rulers faced a problem that metal coins and even paper money couldn't solve: how to store value safely and move wealth efficiently across vast distances without risking robbery, loss, or the logistical nightmare of transporting massive quantities of currency. The solution would emerge from an unlikely collaboration between necessity and innovation, giving birth to one of humanity's most transformative inventions: banking. But the story of banking doesn't begin in marble halls or counting houses. It begins in temples, where the sacred and the commercial first learned to coexist. The earliest banking systems appeared in the ancient world in the temples of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. Religious institutions possessed something that made them natural centers for financial activity. They were trusted, permanent, and protected. A temple to Marduk in Babylon or Athena in Athens wasn't going to disappear overnight or betray its obligations. The gods, people reasoned, made excellent business partners. These temple banks offered services that seem remarkably modern. They accepted deposits, made loans, and even provided what we might recognize as checking accounts. A merchant could deposit silver in the temple of Enlil in Nippur and receive a clay tablet that could be presented later to withdraw the same value, the world's first bank receipt. But it was during the medieval period, particularly in the Islamic world and Renaissance Italy, that banking truly came of age as a sophisticated financial system. In the bustling commercial centers of Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and later Venice, Florence, and Genoa, wealthy merchant families began offering services that transformed how international trade operated. The breakthrough innovation was the development of credit instruments that could move value across space and time without moving physical currency.
A trader in Cairo could deposit gold dinars with a banker and receive a letter of credit that could be honored weeks later in Damascus or Constantinople. This system, remarkably similar to modern checking accounts, made long-distance trade both safer and more efficient. These weren't just individual entrepreneurs, they were family dynasties that built financial empires spanning continents. The Medici family of Florence became more powerful than many kings, not through conquest, but through their mastery of international finance. They didn't just store money, they moved it, multiplied it, and controlled access to it across Europe. At the heart of this transformation was a radical reconceptualization of what money could be. For the first time in history, money didn't need to exist physically at all times. A merchant's wealth could exist as numbers in a ledger, promises written on parchment, or agreements recorded in account books. Value had become truly abstract. This abstraction enabled the development of credit, the ability to spend money that didn't yet exist based on the promise to repay it in the future. Entire trade networks began operating not on actual coins, but on confidence and trust. A Venetian merchant could finance a trading expedition to Constantinople using money he hadn't yet earned, backed by nothing more than his reputation and the banker's belief in future profits. The psychological implications were staggering. Wealth was no longer limited by what you could physically possess. A banker's influence extended far beyond what he could carry in his strongbox. It reached into every corner of economic activity where his letters of credit were honored and his financial promises were trusted. Banks began creating money through the act of lending. When a bank made a loan, it wasn't just redistributing existing wealth, it was calling new money into existence through the borrower's promise to repay it. This power to literally create value through written agreements made banking families among the most influential forces in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Of course, with this abstract power came abstract risks. Banking introduced entirely new ways for economic systems to fail. Bank runs, where depositors lost confidence and demanded their money simultaneously, could destroy financial institutions overnight. Defaults, fraud, and economic bubbles all grew from the seeds of credit-based banking. But there was no turning back. The advantages of banking, the ability to move capital efficiently, to fund large-scale enterprises, to smooth out the ups and downs of individual economic fortunes, proved too valuable for any advanced economy to abandon. Medieval banking families like the Medici, the Fuggers, and the Lombard merchants created the financial infrastructure that would support the Renaissance, fund the age of exploration, and eventually evolve into the complex global banking systems we depend on today. They proved that money had evolved beyond physical objects to become something much more powerful and dangerous. A system of relationships, promises, and shared beliefs that could create unprecedented prosperity or devastating collapse depending on how carefully it was managed. The transformation of money from object to record, from possession to promise, represented one of the most significant intellectual achievements in human history. It required societies to develop new levels of trust, new legal frameworks, and new ways of thinking about value, time, and human relationships. In many ways, we're still learning to manage the power and responsibility that comes with this abstract form of wealth.
And now, my friends, we arrive at our present moment. A time when the ancient human need to exchange value has evolved into something that would seem like magic to those early shepherds trading goats for grain. Today, when you tap your phone to pay for coffee or transfer money across the globe with a few swipes, you're engaging in transactions that involve not a single physical coin or paper bill. No metal, no paper, just streams of data flowing through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. And yet, somehow, the trade is real, the goods are exchanged, and the system holds together. We've entered what historians might call the era of invisible money. The journey from shells and silver to digital code represents one of the most profound transformations in human civilization. Currency has become pure information, numbers stored on servers, updated in real time, managed by computer systems that most people will never see or understand. With a digital bank account, you no longer hold money in any physical sense. You access it, like tuning into a radio station that broadcasts your wealth. Money now moves at the speed of light, crossing international borders in milliseconds, buying stocks in Tokyo from a bedroom in Toledo, funding startup companies in Silicon Valley with investments from pension funds in Stockholm. The constraints of geography, time zones, and physical transportation have been almost entirely eliminated from monetary systems. But perhaps the most radical innovation of our time is cryptocurrency, a bold experiment in trust without authority that would have baffled ancient kings and medieval bankers alike. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and thousands of other digital currencies exist without any central government, any king's face stamped on coins, any Federal Reserve System to back their value. Instead, they rely on something called blockchain technology, essentially a decentralized ledger verified by thousands of independent computers around the world. These cryptocurrencies don't exist in bank vaults or government treasuries. They exist only as mathematical proofs, complex equations that can be solved, traded, and stored, but never physically touched. And yet, people are using these mathematical abstractions to buy homes, cars, works of art, and everyday goods. Some individuals have become millionaires by owning nothing more than strings of code that exist only in digital form. It's perhaps the ultimate expression of money's evolution from physical object to pure concept. We've come an incredibly long way from those first farmers trading surplus grain for fish by the riverside. And yet, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the fundamental essence of money has never changed. Whether we're talking about cowrie shells, silver coins, paper note banks, or cryptocurrency, money is still built on the same ancient foundation that held those early trade relationships together: trust. Trust that the object or symbol or digital code in your possession can be exchanged for something you want. Trust that other people will accept it as valuable. Trust that the system itself will continue to function tomorrow, next week, next year. It's a social contract whispered across time, from the first handshake agreements between neighboring tribes to the blockchain protocols that verify Bitcoin transactions. What's remarkable is how this ancient need for trusted exchange has adapted to every technological revolution in human history. We've moved from barter to commodity money to precious metals to minted coins to paper currency to banking systems to digital transfers to cryptocurrency. But the underlying human behavior remains unchanged. We need ways to trade with each other, and we need to trust that these trading systems will be fair and reliable. The future of money might be cashless, contactless, and entirely digital, but its roots stretch backward through every phase of human civilization. The clay tablets of Mesopotamian merchants, the scales used to weigh silver in ancient markets, the gardens of cowrie shells in African kingdoms, all of these are ancestors of the smartphone in your pocket that can instantly transfer value to someone on the opposite side of the planet. No matter how sophisticated our monetary technology becomes, money will always be more than just a tool for buying and selling goods. It's a language that allows human societies to express their values, priorities, and relationships. It's a way of keeping score in the complex game of civilization. And it's a mirror that reflects our deepest beliefs about fairness, trust, and what makes life meaningful. As we face an uncertain future filled with new technological possibilities and challenges, it's worth remembering that money, in all its forms, has always been fundamentally about human connection. It's about our willingness to trust each other, to work together, and to believe that cooperation can make everyone's life better than it would be in isolation. From goats and grain to global cryptocurrency markets, we've been telling the same story for thousands of years. The story of people learning to trust each other across distance and time. As we reach the end of our long journey together tonight, my friends, let's take a moment to step back and see the vast landscape we've traveled. From the corrupt popes who turned the Vatican into their personal playgrounds, to the mysterious gardens that may have bloomed in ancient Babylon, to the evolution of money from shells to digital code, to the epic tales of Troy that still echo in our hearts, we've explored thousands of years of human experience, human folly, and human triumph. What connects all these stories? What thread runs through the darkest papal scandals and the most beautiful legends of the ancient world? I think it's this: the recognition that humans are capable of extraordinary things, both wonderful and terrible. We can create gardens that defy nature and wage wars that last decades. We can invent money systems that span continents and corrupt sacred offices for personal gain. We can build legends that last millennia and create institutions that either serve humanity or exploit it. The worst popes we explored tonight, John the 12th, Benedict the 9th, Alexander the 6th, and all the rest, they remind us that power without accountability, authority without humility, inevitably becomes tyranny. These men had access to the highest spiritual office in Western civilization, and they used it for the lowest possible purposes. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings about what happens when we give unlimited power to flawed human beings. But then we traveled to ancient Babylon and explored the mystery of the Hanging Gardens. Whether they were real or legendary, they represent something beautiful about human nature, our refusal to accept that impossible things must remain impossible. The idea that a king might build paradise in the desert for a homesick queen speaks to our capacity for love, creativity, and the determination to make beauty flourish even in the harshest circumstances. The evolution of money tells us another kind of story, about trust, cooperation, and the gradual development of increasingly complex ways for human societies to work together. From the first trade agreements between neighboring tribes to the global digital currencies of today, money has always been about more than just buying and selling. It's been about learning to trust each other across time and distance, about creating systems that allow strangers to cooperate for mutual benefit. And the legends of Troy, whether historically accurate or purely mythological, they remind us that some stories are too important to be limited by facts. The Trojan War became a mirror in which every generation could see reflections of their own struggles with love, honor, pride, and loss. It's lasted for thousands of years, not because we can prove it happened, but because it speaks to eternal truths about what it means to be human. What strikes me most as I think about all these stories is how they reveal both the consistency and the change in human nature across millennia. The corrupt popes of the medieval period were driven by the same basic appetites: greed, lust, pride, the abuse of power that we see in corrupt leaders today. The ancient traders who developed the first currency systems were solving the same fundamental problems of trust and cooperation that blockchain developers are working on right now. But we've also seen genuine progress. The agricultural revolution that allowed cities like Babylon to exist, the intellectual achievements that created complex monetary systems, the literary genius that preserved the stories of Troy, these represent real advances in human capability and understanding. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that we are all part of something much larger than ourselves. Every pope, no matter how corrupt, was shaped by the institution of the church and the broader currents of medieval politics. Every ancient city, no matter how grand, was built on the accumulated knowledge and labor of countless generations. Every story, no matter how legendary, carries within it the hopes and fears of the people who told and retold it across centuries. This perspective can be both humbling and empowering.
humbling because it reminds us that our individual lives are small parts of a much larger human story, but empowering because it shows us that our choices matter, that how we use whatever power we have, whether we choose to create or to destroy, whether we build bridges or walls, whether we tell stories that inspire or stories that divide, all of this contributes to the ongoing human narrative. The corrupt popes remind us to be vigilant about power. The hanging gardens inspire us to attempt the impossible. The evolution of money teaches us about trust and cooperation. The legends of Troy show us the power of stories to shape identity and meaning across generations. As you go about your lives in the days and weeks ahead, remember that you're carrying forward this ancient human story. The choices you make, the work you do, the relationships you build, the stories you tell your children, all of this becomes part of the great tapestry of human experience that future generations will inherit. And that, my friends, might be the most beautiful truth of all. That we are all connected across time, that every generation builds on what came before, and that the story of humanity is still being written. We are all part of something magnificent, something ongoing, something much larger than any individual life, but made meaningful by every individual choice. From all of us here, thank you for joining us on this journey through the corridors of history. Thank you for your curiosity, your engagement, and for being part of our community. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. There are so many more stories to explore together. And from wherever you are in this world, whatever time it is as you listen to these final words, sleep well tonight. Dream of hanging gardens and ancient coins, of courage found in unexpected places, of beauty that outlasts empires. Good night.